The winter of 1941 was brutal on the Eastern Front. Snowstorms swept across the Soviet plains, and temperatures plummeted to levels that froze fuel in tanks and left soldiers shivering in makeshift trenches. But in this alternate timeline, a critical decision changed the course of history. Adolf Hitler, dismissing his generals' protests, delayed Operation Barbarossa by only a few weeks instead of the fateful months it took in our reality. The German forces, reinforced with additional panzer divisions and supplied by an early discovery of Soviet oil reserves in Ukraine, launched their assault with devastating precision. By the time the snows came, Moscow was surrounded. The fall of Moscow in December 1941 shattered the Soviet Union. Stalin, cut off from his command center, fled to the Urals, but the Red Army, demoralized and leaderless, began to fracture. With its industrial heartland under German control, the USSR was unable to mount a significant counteroffensive. By mid-1942, the Nazi banner hung over the Kremlin, and Hitler declared the Soviet Union effectively dissolved. The vast resources of Eastern Europe and Siberia were now at the Nazis' disposal, fueling the Third Reich's war machine and emboldening Hitler's vision of a global empire. On the Western Front, the United Kingdom stood as the last bastion of resistance in Europe. The fall of France in 1940 had been a crushing blow, and now, without the Soviets to divide German attention, Britain faced the full might of the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. In this alternate reality, the Nazis' strategy shifted. Hitler, rather than initiating an immediate invasion, opted for a sustained campaign of aerial bombardment and economic strangulation. With German U-boats blockading supply routes and devastating RAF airfields, Britain's lifelines began to fail. By 1943, under relentless pressure and growing domestic unrest, the British government sued for peace. Churchill, unwilling to capitulate, was forced to step aside, leaving a neutral but defeated Britain to endure a puppet regime under German influence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched in horror as Europe fell. Japan, emboldened by the swift Axis victories, launched a more aggressive Pacific campaign. By the time Pearl Harbor came under attack, the Japanese fleet had already seized Midway and was preparing for an invasion of Hawaii. The United States, now engaged on two fronts, faced a grim reality. Its allies in Europe were gone, and its own forces were stretched thin. Isolationist voices grew louder in Congress, arguing that the U.S. should focus on defending its own shores rather than engaging in a global war it was unlikely to win. By 1944, the Axis powers controlled nearly all of Europe, large swaths of Asia, and the Pacific. The Nazi regime, flush with resources and technological advancements, launched a series of devastating new weapons, including the first operational jet fighters and long-range rockets capable of striking American cities. In this world, Hitler's nuclear program did not falter. By 1945, the Nazis had successfully tested an atomic bomb in the Ural Mountains. The demonstration of such destructive power brought the world to its knees. The United States, under President Charles Lindbergh, elected on a platform of neutrality in 1944, signed a non-aggression pact with Germany and Japan, effectively ending its involvement in the war. The Holocaust, intensified by the lack of Allied resistance, continued unchecked, exterminating millions more. Camps expanded eastward, into the conquered Soviet territories, and the machinery of genocide operated on a scale far beyond what history remembers. By the time 1950 dawned, the world was unrecognizable. The Greater Germanic Empire spanned from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains, with plans to colonize Siberia and eradicate any trace of Slavic culture. Japan ruled much of the Pacific, including China, Southeast Asia, and Australia, enforcing its will with ruthless efficiency. The dream of global fascism had become a nightmarish reality, its grip enforced by propaganda, surveillance, and unspeakable violence. But cracks were already beginning to form. Resistance movements, though fragmented and outgunned, persisted in the shadows. scientists and intellectuals fled Axis territories, carrying with them whispers of plans to strike back. And in the hearts of those living under occupation, a spark of defiance refused to be extinguished. This was the world of 1950, a world reshaped by a single turning point. A world where the Axis powers had won. By the mid-1950s, the Axis powers had carved the world into three sprawling spheres of influence. Nazi Germany controlled Europe and much of Eurasia, Japan dominated East Asia and the Pacific, and Italy, though overshadowed by its more powerful allies, governed parts of North Africa and the Mediterranean. The former allies were reduced to isolated holdouts, their influence diminished, their populations living under regimes of fear or reluctant neutrality. In Europe, the Greater Germanic Empire ruled with an iron fist. The continent's map had been redrawn, with Germany annexing vast swaths of land in the east and establishing puppet states across Western and Southern Europe. The United Kingdom, once the Axis' fiercest opponent, had fallen into collaboration after its surrender. The British Isles, now a neutralized state under the leadership of a pro-German regime, served as a grim example of how resistance could be extinguished through economic blockades, propaganda, and military intimidation. Former allies like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were similarly subjugated, their governments reduced to mere administrative branches of Berlin. Eastern Europe faced the harshest realities of Axis domination. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan race, was implemented with brutal efficiency. The Slavic populations of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia were decimated or enslaved, their lands repurposed for German settlers. Entire villages were erased, their inhabitants shipped to labor camps or extermination facilities. Nazi ideology shaped every facet of life in the occupied East, with policies aimed at erasing local cultures and histories. The region became a vast colony, its resources extracted to fuel the Nazi war machine and its lands transformed into the agricultural and industrial backbone of the Reich. Japan's empire, meanwhile, extended from China to the Pacific Islands and down to Australia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, initially presented as a liberation from Western colonial powers, revealed itself as another oppressive empire. In China, puppet regimes enforced Japanese control, while dissent was met with overwhelming force. The infamous Unit 731 continued its experiments on prisoners, advancing Japanese medical and chemical warfare capabilities at horrific human costs. Southeast Asia, rich in rubber, oil, and tin, became a resource hub for Japan, its people exploited as laborers. In Australia, a Japanese occupation government imposed strict racial hierarchies, segregating the indigenous population and European-descended Australians under a system reminiscent of apartheid. In the Mediterranean and parts of Africa, Italy's ambitions faltered in the shadow of Germany and Japan. Mussolini's regime struggled to maintain control over its territories, which included Libya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Italian colonies, while brutal in their exploitation, lacked the industrial and administrative efficiency of their Axis partners. Rome remained a symbolic rather than strategic center of Axis power, its influence waning as Hitler's vision for a German-dominated world overshadowed Mussolini's dreams of a Roman revival. Across the Atlantic, the Americas were divided by ideology and geography. The United States, under a policy of neutrality established in the late 1940s, remained a superpower in potential but refrained from engaging the Axis militarily. President Lindbergh's administration focused on fortifying the Western Hemisphere, negotiating with Germany and Japan to maintain peace while preparing for the possibility of future conflict. South America, meanwhile, became a patchwork of pro-Axis regimes and neutral states. Countries like Brazil and Argentina, with pre-existing fascist sympathies, aligned themselves with Germany and Japan, receiving economic and military support in exchange for their loyalty. The division of the world into Axis spheres of influence created a new global order, but it was far from stable. The Axis alliance, forged out of shared ambition, began to strain under the weight of competing interests. Germany and Japan, while maintaining outward unity, saw their visions for the future diverge. Germany's dominance over Europe and its push into the resource-rich territories of Central Asia encroached on Japan's interests in the region. In Africa, Italian administrators resented German interference in their colonial affairs, leading to tensions between Berlin and Rome. Meanwhile, resistance simmered beneath the surface. In the shadows of cities like Warsaw, Paris, and Shanghai, underground networks of fighters, spies, and dissidents waged a silent war against their occupiers. In the United States, public opinion began to shift as news of Axis atrocities trickled through smuggled reports and escaped refugees. Across the globe, whispers of rebellion grew louder, and the Axis regimes found themselves increasingly consumed by the need to maintain control over their vast territories. The division of the world after the Axis victory was not merely physical but psychological. The ideals of democracy, freedom, and equality, once championed by the Allies, were suppressed but not extinguished. For every occupied city and conquered nation, there were those who refused to accept the new order. Their resistance, though fragmented and perilous, carried the hope that the Axis dominance would one day crumble under its own weight. As the 1950s drew to a close, the world stood at a crossroads. The Axis powers appeared invincible, their banners flying over half the globe. Yet the cracks in their empire were beginning to show, hinting at the possibility of a future shaped not by the victors of World War II, but by those who dared to resist them. By the late 1950s, life within the Greater Germanic Empire bore little resemblance to the world that had existed before the Axis victory. Adolf Hitler's vision for a totalitarian state had been realized on an unprecedented scale, reshaping Europe, and much of Eurasia, into a society governed by fear, propaganda, and rigid social hierarchies. While the outward trappings of prosperity and order masked the realities of the regime, those living under Nazi rule experienced a world of unrelenting control, systemic brutality, and cultural erasure. In major cities like Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, the Nazi aesthetic was omnipresent. Towering government buildings, adorned with swastikas and massive statues, symbolized the empire's power and permanence. Hitler's grand architectural plans, spearheaded by Albert Speer, were brought to life with the forced labor of millions. Berlin, renamed Germania, stood as the empire's capital and centerpiece, a sprawling metropolis of stark, monumental structures designed to project dominance and awe. The city's transformation came at a staggering human cost, with entire neighborhoods razed and their inhabitants displaced to make way for Hitler's dream. Daily life in the Reich was a carefully orchestrated performance. Citizens were bombarded with propaganda through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films, all controlled by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Messages glorified the Nazi Party, celebrated the empire's victories, and vilified enemies both real and imagined. Education was restructured to indoctrinate the youth, with schools emphasizing racial purity, obedience to the Führer, and the supposed superiority of Germanic culture. For those who conformed, the regime offered a sense of stability and purpose. Middle-class Germans, in particular, enjoyed the benefits of the Reich's economic policies, which focused on autarky and the exploitation of conquered territories. Consumer goods, once scarce during the war, became more widely available, though much of this prosperity was built on the suffering of enslaved laborers in the East. For some, the illusion of order and progress obscured the atrocities taking place just beyond the empire's borders. In the occupied territories, life was far bleaker. Eastern Europe, designated as living space for the Aryan race, became the site of widespread ethnic cleansing. The remaining Slavic populations were subjected to forced labor, with millions sent to work in factories, mines, and agricultural estates under inhumane conditions. Cities like Warsaw and Kiev were depopulated and repurposed for German settlers, their histories erased in an effort to remake the region in the Nazi image. Resistance was met with swift and brutal reprisals, including mass executions, deportations, and the destruction of entire villages. For the Jewish people, the Holocaust continued unabated. With no Allied forces to liberate concentration camps, the Nazis expanded their genocidal operations. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became central to the final solution, processing millions more victims from across Europe. The extermination program extended into the newly conquered territories of the Soviet Union, where mobile killing units and newly constructed camps accelerated the pace of genocide. By the 1960s, Jewish communities in Europe had been almost entirely eradicated, along with Romani populations, political dissidents, LGBTQ individuals, and other groups deemed undesirable by the regime. The surveillance state reached unprecedented levels under the Gestapo, and SS informants were embedded in every community, and the slightest hint of dissent could result in arrest, torture, or execution. Families lived in fear of neighbors, colleagues, and even relatives, as loyalty to the state was prioritized above all else. The concept of privacy all but disappeared, with homes, workplaces, and even public spaces subject to constant monitoring. Cultural life under the Reich was carefully curated to align with Nazi ideology. Music, art, and literature were purged of influences considered degenerate, such as modernism, jazz, and anything associated with Jewish or Slavic traditions. Instead, the regime promoted works that glorified Germanic folklore, classical forms, and militaristic themes. The film industry flourished under directors like Leni Riefenstahl, producing grand spectacles that celebrated the Nazi Party and reinforced the regime's mythology. While life in the Reich appeared orderly to the outside world, cracks in the system were evident to those who looked closely. The economy, heavily reliant on plundered resources and slave labor, was unsustainable in the long term. The rigid social hierarchy bred resentment among conquered populations and even within the ranks of the German elite. Resistance movements, though fragmented and outgunned, continued to disrupt the regime's operations through sabotage, espionage, and underground networks. Despite the oppression, hope persisted. In secret, dissidents circulated banned literature, hosted clandestine meetings, and planned acts of defiance. For those living under Nazi rule, resistance was not only a fight for survival but a declaration of humanity in the face of tyranny. These small acts of rebellion, though seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme, kept alive the possibility of a future beyond the Reich. As the 1960s approached, the empire Hitler had built appeared unassailable. Yet the cracks in its foundations hinted at a growing instability. Beneath the surface, the weight of maintaining such a vast and oppressive system threatened to overwhelm even the most meticulously planned regime. The question was not if the Reich would fall, but when, and at what cost. As Europe and much of Asia fell under the grip of the Axis powers, the Americas faced a stark choice: resist or accommodate. The United States, once a beacon of democratic ideals and a formidable military power, was forced to reckon with a new geopolitical reality. Isolated from its former European allies and stretched thin by Japan's dominance in the Pacific, the U.S. pivoted inward, prioritizing its own survival. Meanwhile, Latin America became a battleground for influence, with pro-Axis factions gaining ground in several nations, further threatening the continent's stability. By the late 1940s, the United States had adopted a policy of strategic neutrality. After the fall of Britain and the Soviet Union, public sentiment shifted decisively against continued involvement in the global conflict. Charles Lindbergh, an outspoken isolationist, rose to political prominence and won the 1944 presidential election on a platform of peace through disengagement. Under his administration, the U.S. negotiated a non-aggression pact with Germany and Japan, effectively conceding Axis dominance in Europe and Asia in exchange for guarantees of American territorial integrity. While the U.S. remained formally independent, the terms of the pact imposed significant restrictions on its foreign policy and trade. The once mighty American economy, deprived of access to key markets in Europe and Asia, began to stagnate. German and Japanese industries, fueled by resources extracted from their empires, flooded the global market with goods, undermining American manufacturing. At the same time, German scientists, many of whom had fled to the US in the real timeline, remained in Europe, accelerating the Axis technological advantage. In Latin America, the Axis powers found fertile ground for expansion. Even before World War II, fascist movements had gained traction in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, fueled by economic instability and dissatisfaction with democratic governance. After the Axis victory, these movements grew stronger, supported by covert German and Japanese efforts to establish political and economic footholds. Argentina, under the leadership of Juan Perón, aligned itself closely with Germany, adopting many of the hallmarks of fascist governance. Nazi advisors helped reorganize Argentina's military and bureaucracy, while German businesses invested heavily in the country's industrial infrastructure. Buenos Aires became a hub for Axis influence in the Western Hemisphere, a symbol of the New World Order taking shape. Brazil, long seen as a potential rival to Argentina for regional dominance, found itself divided. While the government maintained nominal neutrality, pro-Axis factions gained influence in the military and business sectors. German and Japanese immigrants in Brazil formed cultural associations that became conduits for Axis propaganda, spreading the ideology of racial superiority and authoritarian rule. Other nations in the region, like Mexico and Venezuela, resisted Axis encroachment but faced immense pressure. Mexico, with its proximity to the U.S., became a critical partner in American efforts to maintain a buffer against Axis influence. Venezuela, rich in oil, found itself caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war, with German and Japanese interests vying for access to its resources. The Panama Canal, a strategic lifeline for the Americas, became a focal point of tension. The United States fortified the canal heavily, deploying troops and constructing advanced defenses to prevent Axis interference. Yet, the canal's significance also made it a target for sabotage and espionage, with German and Japanese agents infiltrating the region to disrupt American control. In Canada, the fall of Britain had profound implications. Cut off from its traditional ally and protector, Canada was forced to seek closer ties with the United States. However, this partnership was fraught with challenges, as Canadian leaders resisted American attempts to impose military and economic policies that prioritized U.S. interests. German propaganda sought to exploit these tensions, encouraging separatist movements in Quebec and other regions. As the Axis consolidated its influence in Latin America, resistance movements emerged, inspired by the ideals of freedom and democracy that had once defined the Western Hemisphere. These movements, though fragmented and underfunded, carried out acts of sabotage against Axis-aligned governments and businesses. In Argentina, dissidents formed underground networks to oppose Perón's regime, while in Brazil, workers organized strikes to protest pro-Axis policies. For the United States, the fate of the Americas was a constant source of anxiety. While Lindbergh's administration maintained a policy of neutrality, the growing Axis presence in the region posed an existential threat. Military planners warned of the possibility of a coordinated Axis invasion, using Latin America as a staging ground to attack the U.S. mainland. These fears prompted the U.S. to expand its military presence in the region, deploying troops to strategic locations like the Caribbean and Central America. By the mid-1950s, the Americas had become a microcosm of the larger global struggle between democracy and totalitarianism. While the United States and its allies clung to their independence, the shadow of the Axis loomed large. Latin America, once a region of diverse political systems and cultures, had become a battleground for competing ideologies, its future uncertain. As the Axis powers extended their reach across the globe, the question remained, could the Americas resist the tide, or would they too succumb to the new order? In the aftermath of the Axis victory, Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere evolved from a wartime ambition into a sprawling empire that dominated the Pacific and much of Asia. Initially framed as a movement to liberate Asian nations from Western colonial rule, the co-prosperity sphere became a brutal and exploitative regime. Under Japanese control, the region underwent profound political, social, and economic transformations, but these came at an extraordinary human cost. By the early 1950s, Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to Australia, encompassing China, Korea, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and parts of the Indian subcontinent. Each of these regions played a specific role in the empire's vision. China and Southeast Asia provided resources and labor, Korea served as an industrial and agricultural hub, and the Pacific Islands acted as strategic military outposts. Australia, occupied after the fall of the Allied forces in the Pacific, became the southernmost outpost of Japanese expansion, used for agriculture and as a base for further incursions into the region. The co-prosperity sphere was governed from Tokyo, where Japan's military elite and political leaders established a rigid hierarchy of control. Puppet governments were installed in many territories, including the Yuan Jingwei regime in China, which collaborated with Japanese authorities to suppress resistance. These governments, however, were little more than extensions of Tokyo's will, their power limited to enforcing Japanese policies. In China, the occupation was particularly harsh. Following the fall of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and the suppression of communist forces, Japan consolidated its control over the country. Cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing were heavily militarized, with Japanese troops patrolling the streets and enforcing strict curfews. The looting of resources, particularly coal, oil, and agricultural products, intensified, leaving millions of Chinese impoverished and malnourished. The use of forced labor became widespread throughout the co-prosperity sphere. Millions of Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, and Southeast Asians were conscripted to work in mines, factories, and construction projects under appalling conditions. The Burma-Thailand Railway, often called the Death Railway, became a symbol of this exploitation, as tens of thousands of laborers and prisoners of war died constructing the grueling jungle route. Japan's imperial ambitions were built on the backs of these workers, whose suffering was largely ignored by the regime. Cultural assimilation was another cornerstone of Japan's rule. In Korea, Japan imposed a policy of erasure, banning the Korean language in schools, replacing Korean names with Japanese ones, and forcing cultural conformity through state propaganda. Temples, statues, and historical sites that did not align with Japan's vision of its empire were destroyed or repurposed. A similar process unfolded in Taiwan and parts of Southeast Asia, where local traditions and languages were suppressed in favor of Japanese customs. Japan's control of the Pacific Ocean turned it into an impregnable fortress. The empire fortified islands like Guam, Saipan, and Midway, transforming them into bases equipped with airstrips, naval ports, and anti-aircraft defenses. These outposts ensured Japan's dominance over trade routes and made it nearly impossible for other powers, including the United States, to challenge its naval superiority. While Japan presented itself as a liberator, many Asian nations soon discovered that Japanese rule was as oppressive as, if not more so than, the Western colonial regimes it had replaced. In the Philippines, for example, initial celebrations of liberation from American control gave way to widespread resentment as Japanese forces imposed martial law, conscripted workers, and seized land. Resistance movements, such as the Hikbalahap guerrillas, persisted, though they were met with brutal reprisals. In Indonesia, Japan's occupation dismantled the Dutch colonial administration but replaced it with a system of forced labor and resource extraction. The Japanese co-opted nationalist leaders like Sukarno, using their influence to control the population. While Sukarno's collaboration laid the groundwork for future independence, it also deepened divisions within Indonesian society, as some viewed him as a traitor to the anti-colonial cause. Even in territories with historical ties to Japan, such as Korea and Taiwan, resentment toward Japanese rule grew. In Korea, underground resistance movements smuggled weapons and staged uprisings, while in Taiwan, indigenous populations rebelled against forced assimilation and exploitation. These acts of defiance were met with overwhelming force, as Japan's military crushed rebellions and executed dissidents to maintain control. Japan's dominance in the co-prosperity sphere extended to technological and military advancements. The empire heavily invested in aviation, naval technology, and infrastructure projects to solidify its control. Japan also pursued nuclear weapons research, hoping to match Germany's atomic capabilities and further secure its position as a global power. These technological developments came at the cost of human experimentation, particularly through the infamous Unit 731, which continued its atrocities in occupied territories, testing biological and chemical weapons on civilians. Despite its outward strength, the co-prosperity sphere was far from stable. The vast distances between territories, combined with the diversity of cultures and languages, made governance challenging. Resistance movements in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia strained Japanese resources, forcing the empire to divert troops and supplies to quell uprisings. Economic exploitation, while enriching Japan, impoverished its colonies, fostering widespread resentment that undermined the legitimacy of Japanese rule. By the late 1950s, cracks were beginning to show in Japan's imperial facade. The resistance movements grew bolder, staging coordinated attacks on Japanese infrastructure and military installations. Rivalries between Japan and Germany, particularly over resource-rich Central Asia, created tensions within the Axis alliance. And within Japan itself, discontent simmered among citizens who questioned the morality and sustainability of the empire's ambitions. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, once envisioned as a utopia of Asian unity, had become a dystopian reality of exploitation and oppression. While Japan's dominance appeared unshakable, the seeds of resistance and rebellion hinted at a future where the empire's grip might one day falter. The Axis victory in World War II marked the dawn of a new global economic system, one designed to fuel the ambitions of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. With vast territories under their control, the Axis powers reshaped trade routes, restructured industries, and exploited resources on an unprecedented scale. What emerged was an economy of extraction, subjugation, and technological dominance that enriched the Axis regimes while condemning much of the world to servitude and poverty. At the heart of the Axis economic order was a relentless focus on resource acquisition. Nazi Germany, now in control of Europe, much of Eurasia, and parts of the Middle East, seized vast oil reserves in the Caucasus and Persia, fueling its war machine and industrial expansion. The fertile plains of Ukraine, once the breadbasket of Europe, were transformed into the Reich's agricultural heartland, worked by millions of enslaved laborers. Rare earth minerals and metals from Siberia were mined at an astonishing pace, powering German advancements in technology and weaponry. The Nazi regime imposed strict economic hierarchies within its territories. Occupied nations were reduced to colonies, their industries dismantled or repurposed to serve German interests. Factories in France, Poland, and Czechoslovakia produced goods exclusively for the Reich, with local populations conscripted into forced labor. This system, known as the New Economic Plan, ensured that wealth and resources flowed upward to the German elite, leaving the conquered populations impoverished and dependent on German largesse for survival. Currency manipulation became another tool of economic control. In occupied territories, local currencies were either abolished or pegged to the Reichsmark at artificially devalued rates, allowing Germany to purchase goods and resources at minimal cost. The financial systems of these nations were integrated into the Reich's banking network, effectively eliminating their economic sovereignty. Japan adopted a similar approach in the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The empire's vast reach encompassed resource-rich regions, including the oil fields of Indonesia, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the tin mines of Thailand. These resources were transported to Japan's industrial centers, fueling its rapid technological development and military buildup. In the Pacific, Japan created a maritime empire, dominating trade routes and ensuring that goods and resources flowed exclusively to its ports. The Japanese military enforced strict control over these routes, eliminating piracy and rival shipping lines, but also suppressing local economies that relied on open trade. Southeast Asian economies were reoriented to serve Japan, with entire regions dedicated to producing single commodities for export. The Axis economic system was built on the backs of forced labor. Millions of people across Europe, Asia, and Africa were conscripted into servitude, working in mines, factories, and fields under brutal conditions. In Germany, concentration camp prisoners and enslaved workers from Eastern Europe were the backbone of the industrial workforce. In Japan's territories, local populations were coerced into labor, often under the pretense of contributing to the liberation of Asia. The infamous Burma-Thailand Railway and other infrastructure projects became symbols of this exploitation, as thousands perished in the construction of these monuments to imperial ambition. The Axis economic order also relied on technological superiority. Germany, now unencumbered by the constraints of war with the Allies, invested heavily in advanced industries. Jet aircraft, long-range missiles, and nuclear technology became the cornerstones of its military-industrial complex. Japan, meanwhile, expanded its naval and aviation capabilities, developing carriers, battleships, and advanced submarines to maintain control of the Pacific. These technological advancements further entrenched the Axis dominance, as no rival powers could match their industrial output or military innovation. While the Axis economic system appeared invincible, it was not without weaknesses. The sheer scale of the territories under Axis control created logistical challenges, as resources had to be transported across vast distances. This inefficiency, combined with the resistance movements in occupied territories, strained the empire's ability to maintain control. Sabotage, theft, and strikes by underground networks disrupted supply chains and undermined the Axis economic stability. Resistance also emerged from within. In Germany, some industrialists quietly opposed the regime, siphoning off resources to aid dissident groups or slow production. In Japan, local administrators in occupied territories sometimes sabotaged imperial efforts, diverting resources to support resistance fighters or to sustain local populations. The Axis economic order also faced ideological conflicts. Germany and Japan, while allied, had competing visions for global dominance. Germany's push into Central Asia brought it into direct competition with Japan, particularly over resources in the region. These tensions, though managed diplomatically for the time being, threatened to fracture the alliance in the future. The economic hierarchy imposed by the Axis powers also created resentment among their allies. Italy, often treated as a junior partner by Germany and Japan, struggled to assert control over its African colonies, which were seen as peripheral to the Axis grand strategy. Mussolini's regime, already weakened by internal dissent, found itself increasingly dependent on German support to maintain its influence. By the mid-1950s, the Axis economic order was a machine of immense power but also growing fragility. While it had succeeded in reshaping the global economy to serve its needs, it had done so at the cost of widespread suffering, instability, and resistance. The question was no longer whether this system could sustain itself indefinitely, but how long it could endure before the cracks in its foundation became irreparable. As the Axis powers celebrated their dominance, the seeds of rebellion and collapse were quietly taking root, hinting at a future where their empire might one day crumble under its own weight. In a world where the Axis powers emerged victorious in World War II, technological dominance became the cornerstone of their global hegemony. The unbridled ambition of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, coupled with their vast access to resources and enslaved labor, fueled unprecedented advancements in science, engineering, and military technology. While these developments bolstered their control over the world, they also came at an unimaginable human cost, further entrenching the horrors of their regimes. In Germany, the Reich's scientific community was tasked with fulfilling Hitler's vision of a technologically advanced empire. Freed from the constraints of international oversight and armed with resources extracted from its vast territories, Nazi engineers and scientists accelerated their work on advanced weaponry and infrastructure projects. By the mid-1950s, German research had yielded several breakthroughs, including operational nuclear weapons, long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and space exploration technologies. The Nazi atomic bomb program, which had lagged behind the Allies during the war in our timeline, became a reality in this alternate world. With access to the uranium mines of Central Africa and the scientific expertise of figures like Werner Heisenberg, Germany successfully detonated its first nuclear device in the Ural Mountains in the late 1940s. This achievement solidified the Reich's position as the preeminent military power, with nuclear weapons serving both as a deterrent against rivals and a tool for enforcing its will on the global stage. In addition to nuclear advancements, Germany expanded its missile program, building on the foundation of the V-2 rocket. By the 1950s, the Reich had developed ICBMs capable of striking targets across the Atlantic, effectively neutralizing the United States' ability to challenge its dominance. These missiles, combined with advanced jet fighters and bombers, gave Germany complete control over European airspace and beyond. The Reich also poured resources into space exploration, not for scientific curiosity but as a demonstration of its technological superiority. By the early 1960s, Germany had launched satellites into orbit and was preparing for manned space missions. The propaganda value of these achievements was immense, reinforcing the narrative of Aryan supremacy and the inevitability of Nazi rule. While Germany focused on dominance through weaponry and space exploration, Japan's technological efforts were geared toward naval and aviation advancements. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already one of the most formidable forces during World War II, expanded its capabilities to secure control of the Pacific and its surrounding regions. Advanced aircraft carriers, jet-powered fighter planes, and long-range submarines ensured Japan's naval supremacy, making it virtually impossible for any rival power to challenge its maritime dominance. Japan's engineers also worked on miniaturized nuclear weapons, aiming to deploy them aboard submarines and aircraft for strategic strikes. While Japan lagged slightly behind Germany in nuclear technology, its relentless focus on naval innovation kept its empire secure from external threats. The empire's emphasis on resource efficiency and the integration of cutting-edge technologies into its military infrastructure made it a formidable partner, and occasional rival, to Germany. The Axis powers' technological dominance extended beyond the military. Massive infrastructure projects reshaped the landscapes of Europe and Asia, creating sprawling networks of railways, highways, and fortified cities designed to consolidate Axis control. Germany's Autobahn system, extended across occupied Europe and into Russia, served as both a logistical lifeline and a symbol of Nazi engineering prowess. In Asia, Japan undertook similar projects, including railways connecting its territories in Manchuria, Korea, and Southeast Asia, ensuring the seamless movement of resources and troops across its empire. Advancements in communications technology allowed the Axis regimes to tighten their grip on their populations. The Nazis perfected systems of surveillance and propaganda, using early computer technology and mass media to monitor dissent and indoctrinate citizens. Every home was equipped with state-controlled radios and televisions that broadcast a constant stream of pro-Axis messaging, while networks of informants ensured that resistance was crushed before it could gain momentum. Medical and biological research also advanced under the Axis regimes, though at a horrifying cost. In Germany, the SS conducted experiments on prisoners in concentration camps, pushing the boundaries of human endurance and anatomy. These experiments, while ethically abhorrent, resulted in breakthroughs that were exploited to advance military medicine and biotechnology. Japan's infamous Unit 731 continued its inhumane research in occupied territories, developing biological and chemical weapons that were tested on civilian populations. The regime's disregard for human life made their scientific progress a double-edged sword, fueling their dominance while deepening the atrocities they committed. The Axis technological empire, however, was not without its challenges. The scale of their ambition created logistical bottlenecks, as resources and skilled labor were stretched thin across vast territories. Resistance movements targeted key infrastructure projects, sabotaging railways, factories, and power plants to disrupt Axis control. In addition, the competition between Germany and Japan occasionally led to tensions, as both powers sought to secure their own technological and strategic superiority. The unchecked technological advancements of the Axis powers also raised existential questions about the future of humanity. The development of autonomous weapons, enhanced surveillance systems, and biological warfare threatened to create a dystopian world where freedom and individuality were extinguished. Within the Axis territories, whispers of dissent grew louder, as scientists and engineers who had once supported the regimes began to question the morality of their work. By the late 1950s, the Axis powers stood at the zenith of their technological dominance. Yet, the very tools that had secured their victory also carried the seeds of their potential downfall. The reliance on exploitation and oppression to sustain their advancements created a brittle foundation, vulnerable to internal dissent and the relentless pressure of resistance movements. The world they had built was one of awe-inspiring innovation and terrifying control, a testament to the power of technology, wielded without ethics, in the hands of regimes that sought only domination. In a world where the Axis powers emerged victorious in World War II, the Cold War as we know it, an ideological battle between capitalism and communism, never materialized. Instead, the global stage was dominated by a new kind of tension, the uneasy alliance between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, which threatened to unravel as their competing ambitions clashed. While the United States and a handful of other neutral nations struggled to maintain independence, the two Axis superpowers vied for dominance, creating a geopolitical landscape defined by fragile alliances, covert operations, and the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. The roots of this new global tension lay in the very nature of the Axis alliance. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had united during World War II out of necessity, bound by a shared desire to dismantle the existing world order and establish their respective empires. However, their visions for the future were fundamentally different. Germany's focus was on racial purity, continental hegemony, and the colonization of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Japan, on the other hand, envisioned a maritime empire, controlling the Pacific and much of Asia through its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. By the late 1940s, these differences began to strain the alliance. Germany's push into Central Asia brought its forces into direct contact with Japanese-controlled territories in Manchuria and Mongolia, sparking disputes over resources and borders. The competition for influence in regions like India and the Middle East further deepened the divide, as both powers sought to secure strategic footholds in these resource-rich areas. the tension between Germany and Japan extended to the realm of technology and weaponry. While both powers had developed nuclear weapons, they kept their arsenals tightly guarded, each wary of the other's capabilities. The Nazi development of ICBMs capable of reaching the Pacific heightened Japanese fears, while Japan's advancements in naval-based nuclear delivery systems created unease in Berlin. This mutual suspicion fueled an arms race that dominated the 1950s, as both regimes poured resources into developing ever more destructive weapons. The United States, isolated by choice but not by circumstance, found itself in a precarious position. While President Charles Lindbergh's administration had negotiated a non-aggression pact with the Axis powers, the U.S. remained wary of their expansionist ambitions. American military planners quietly prepared for the possibility of conflict, investing heavily in nuclear weapons and missile defense systems. At the same time, the U.S. engaged in covert efforts to undermine Axis control, supporting resistance movements in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Neutral nations like Canada, Mexico, and Brazil found themselves caught in the crossfire of this new geopolitical order. Canada, though nominally independent, was heavily influenced by the United States and became a critical part of its defense strategy. In Latin America, pro-Axis regimes in countries like Argentina and Chile clashed with anti-Axis governments, creating a patchwork of alliances and rivalries that mirrored the broader global tension. The covert nature of this conflict gave rise to a world of espionage and subterfuge. Both Germany and Japan maintained extensive intelligence networks, infiltrating each other's territories as well as those of neutral nations. Spy agencies like the Nazi Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and Japan's Kempeitai engaged in sabotage, assassination, and counterintelligence operations, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. The United States, though officially neutral, also played a role in this shadow war, using its own intelligence agencies to gather information and disrupt Axis activities. While the rivalry between Germany and Japan was the primary axis of tension, resistance movements played a critical role in shaping the global landscape. In Europe, underground networks continued to fight against Nazi rule, staging acts of sabotage and gathering intelligence for the United States and other sympathetic nations. In Asia, guerrilla fighters in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia waged a relentless campaign against Japanese forces, often with tacit support from rival Axis powers or neutral nations. The global economy became another battleground in this unspoken conflict. Germany and Japan, while nominally allies, competed for control of resources and trade routes. Germany's exploitation of Eastern Europe and Russia provided it with a vast supply of minerals, oil, and agricultural products, while Japan's dominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific made it a powerhouse in rubber, tin, and oil production. However, their mutual reliance on these resources created a delicate balance, as disruptions in one region could have cascading effects on both empires. Culturally, the divide between Germany and Japan became increasingly apparent. Nazi Germany promoted a vision of Aryan supremacy, dismissing Japan as a useful but ultimately inferior partner. Japan, in turn, emphasized its role as the leader of Asia, portraying itself as a liberator from Western imperialism while quietly resenting Germany's condescension. Propaganda from both sides reflected this underlying tension, with Germany celebrating its technological and military achievements while Japan emphasized its spiritual and cultural superiority. The 1950s were marked by a series of crises that brought the world to the brink of open conflict. One such flashpoint occurred in Central Asia, where German forces clashed with Japanese-backed militias over control of key oil fields. Another crisis unfolded in the Middle East, as German and Japanese intelligence agencies supported rival factions in an attempt to secure influence over the region's vast oil reserves. These incidents, though contained, highlighted the fragility of the Axis alliance and the potential for escalation. Despite these tensions, both Germany and Japan understood the risks of open war. The presence of nuclear weapons acted as a deterrent, forcing both sides to pursue their goals through covert means rather than direct confrontation. This balance of terror created a world reminiscent of the Cold War, though the ideological divide was not between communism and capitalism but between two competing visions of totalitarian domination. By the early 1960s, the cracks in the Axis alliance were becoming impossible to ignore. Germany and Japan, while still nominal allies, had become rivals in every sense of the word. Their competition for resources, influence, and technological superiority threatened to ignite a conflict that could devastate the world. At the same time, resistance movements in neutral nations began to find new opportunities to challenge Axis control, exploiting the divisions between the two powers. The Cold War that never was had created a world of relentless tension and perpetual fear. Yet, within this darkness, there remained a spark of hope that the rivalries of the Axis powers might one day lead to their downfall, and that the ideals of freedom and democracy could rise again from the ashes of a conquered world. Despite the Axis powers' iron grip on much of the world, resistance movements emerged as a defiant force against their oppressive rule. From the shattered cities of Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia, rebellion simmered beneath the surface. These movements were diverse, composed of ex-soldiers, displaced civilians, religious leaders, and underground networks, but they were united in their determination to fight back against the Nazi and Japanese empires. In Europe, the Nazi occupation of vast territories fueled an underground war. Resistance movements operated in nearly every conquered nation, from the French Maquis to the Polish Home Army and the Soviet partisans. These groups employed guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and espionage to disrupt Nazi supply lines, assassinate collaborators, and gather intelligence for sympathetic neutral powers like the United States. While many resistance fighters lacked resources and formal military training, their knowledge of local terrain and their unbreakable resolve allowed them to strike at the heart of the Nazi regime's operations. In the cities of Europe, underground networks grew sophisticated. Secret printing presses churned out anti-Nazi propaganda, while covert radio transmitters broadcast messages of hope and resistance. In Berlin, Vienna, and Warsaw, daring acts of defiance became symbols of courage in the face of tyranny. Resistance operatives infiltrated Nazi infrastructure, stealing blueprints, planting explosives, and leaking crucial information to the few remaining neutral powers. The Gestapo responded with brutal crackdowns, but for every cell they destroyed, another would rise in its place. The Axis-controlled East faced the most brutal repression, yet it also saw some of the fiercest resistance. In the forests of Poland and the Ukraine, partisan fighters waged a relentless guerrilla war against Nazi forces. Armed with stolen weapons and supplied by sympathetic locals, these groups disrupted supply routes, ambushed German convoys, and provided a vital lifeline to enslaved laborers seeking to escape Nazi-controlled industries. Entire regions became battlegrounds, as the partisans and the Wehrmacht clashed in a shadow war far from the view of Berlin's propaganda machine. In Japan's territories, resistance was no less determined. In China, guerrilla forces continued to fight despite the collapse of the nationalist and communist armies. Former soldiers, peasants, and intellectuals formed new coalitions, striking Japanese supply depots and ambushing military patrols. The countryside became a patchwork of contested zones, where Japanese forces struggled to maintain control against an enemy that could fade into the landscape and re-emerge unpredictably. Korea, under decades of harsh Japanese rule, saw its own resistance movement evolve. The Korean independence fighters operated both within the peninsula and from exile in neighboring territories. Smuggling weapons, printing anti-Japanese propaganda, and staging assassinations of Japanese officials, they fought to keep the dream of a free Korea alive. Despite brutal reprisals by the Japanese Kempeitai, the resistance refused to be extinguished. In Southeast Asia, anti-Japanese sentiment fueled guerrilla warfare in regions like the Philippines, Malaya, and Burma. Local fighters, often with support from American agents and remnants of Allied forces, carried out ambushes, destroyed infrastructure, and sabotaged Japanese efforts to extract resources. In the Philippines, the Hukbalahap guerrillas, who had resisted both American and Japanese colonization, intensified their efforts, liberating swathes of territory and building support among the rural population. Resistance movements faced immense challenges. The Axis powers were ruthless in their reprisals, employing collective punishment to deter rebellion. Entire villages were destroyed, hostages were executed, and collaborators were rewarded to root out insurgents. Propaganda campaigns portrayed resistance fighters as terrorists, further isolating them from populations that might have otherwise supported them. Yet the Axis powers' heavy-handed tactics often backfired. Brutal reprisals galvanized communities, turning previously neutral populations against their occupiers. In some cases, acts of defiance became rallying points for broader resistance. A single act of sabotage, like the destruction of a railway or the assassination of a high-ranking official, could inspire hundreds to join the fight. The resistance movements were not limited to those living under Axis rule. In neutral nations like the United States, Canada, and parts of Latin America, exiled leaders and dissidents worked tirelessly to support their comrades abroad. Refugee scientists, writers, and politicians formed governments in exile, broadcasting messages of hope and coordinating efforts with underground networks. These groups also lobbied their host nations to provide material support to the resistance, smuggling weapons, medical supplies, and funds into Axis-controlled territories. One of the most significant challenges faced by resistance movements was the lack of unity. Ideological divisions, ethnic rivalries, and differing strategies often hampered their efforts. In Europe, communist partisans clashed with nationalist groups, while in Asia, long-standing ethnic tensions created obstacles to cooperation. However, as the Axis powers tightened their grip, these divisions began to blur. The shared goal of liberation fostered uneasy alliances among factions that might otherwise have been at odds. By the mid-1950s, resistance movements had evolved into a global underground network. Covert operations spanned continents, with fighters in France, Poland, China, and the Philippines sharing tactics, intelligence, and resources. These connections were facilitated by neutral nations, particularly the United States, which, while officially disengaged, covertly supported the resistance through arms shipments, training programs, and intelligence sharing. The technological advancements of the Axis powers, while formidable, also created new opportunities for resistance. Saboteurs targeted critical infrastructure like railways, power plants, and communication lines, exploiting the very systems that the Axis relied upon to maintain control. Acts of sabotage were often timed to coincide with larger uprisings, creating chaos that overwhelmed the Axis ability to respond effectively. By the end of the 1950s, resistance movements had grown bolder, staging coordinated attacks on Axis facilities and symbols of power. In occupied Europe, massive uprisings broke out in several cities, forcing Nazi forces to divert resources from their eastern territories to quell the unrest. In Asia, guerrilla fighters began to reclaim territory in remote regions, eroding Japan's control over its empire. The resistance movements were far from achieving total victory, but their efforts chipped away at the Axis powers' illusion of invincibility. For the millions living under occupation, these acts of defiance provided hope that liberation, though distant, was still possible. The Axis regimes, despite their technological and military dominance, faced a growing realization their control was not as absolute as they had once believed. In this alternate timeline, the Soviet Union never survived the Axis onslaught during World War II. Hitler's relentless push eastward, spearheaded by a reorganized and better prepared Operation Barbarossa, led to the capture of Moscow in late 1941 and the eventual disintegration of the USSR. By the mid-1940s, Nazi Germany had achieved total dominance over Soviet territory, from the Baltic states to the Ural Mountains, leaving a power vacuum that reshaped the region. The collapse of the Soviet Union had profound consequences for the people who lived within its borders. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan race, transformed the former Soviet territories into a nightmarish dystopia of exploitation, ethnic cleansing, and colonization. For the Axis powers, the fall of the USSR marked the fulfillment of a core wartime objective. For the millions of Slavs, Jews, and other minorities who called the region home, it was the beginning of an unimaginable tragedy. After the fall of Moscow, the Soviet leadership fractured. Stalin and his inner circle fled to the Ural Mountains, attempting to establish a temporary government in exile. However, their efforts to regroup were undermined by logistical failures, internal betrayals, and the rapid advance of German forces. By mid-1942, Stalin had been captured and executed by the SS, a symbolic victory for Hitler that was widely publicized as proof of the Reich's unstoppable might. The remnants of the Red Army, scattered and demoralized, continued to fight as partisans in the forests and mountains, but they were no match for the Nazi war machine. The former Soviet Union was divided into territories administered directly by Germany and puppet regimes that acted as extensions of the Reich. The Baltic states, Ukraine, and Belarus were among the first regions to be annexed outright, while the Caucasus and Central Asia became semi-autonomous colonies governed by Nazi-appointed officials. These areas were stripped of their resources, with German engineers overseeing the extraction of oil, coal, and metals vital to the Reich's economy. Ukraine, once the breadbasket of Europe, became a focal point of Hitler's colonization efforts. The Nazis implemented the Hunger Plan, a policy designed to starve local populations while redirecting food supplies to Germany. Millions of Ukrainians perished in the resulting famine, while the survivors were conscripted into forced labor or relocated to make way for German settlers. Entire villages were depopulated, and vast tracts of land were handed over to Aryan colonists who were incentivized to move eastward. The Slavic populations of Russia and Eastern Europe faced systematic persecution under Nazi rule. Hitler's racial ideology deemed Slavs as subhuman, fit only for servitude or extermination. Those who were not immediately executed were forced into labor camps, where they worked under inhumane conditions to support the Reich's infrastructure projects. The gulags of the Soviet era were replaced by Nazi concentration camps, which extended deep into Siberia, processing millions of victims in what became an industrialized system of genocide. The cultural erasure of the Soviet Union was another cornerstone of Nazi policy. The Russian language was banned in schools and public institutions, replaced by German or, in some cases, local dialects deemed acceptable by the Reich. Soviet monuments and symbols were destroyed, and historical narratives were rewritten to glorify Germanic heritage while erasing Slavic contributions. The Orthodox Church, which had endured under Stalin's rule, was systematically dismantled, its clergy imprisoned or executed. While the Nazi regime focused on exploiting the region's resources and subjugating its people, it also faced challenges in maintaining control over such a vast and diverse territory. The resistance movements that emerged in former Soviet lands were among the most determined and resourceful in the Axis-controlled world. Partisans in Belarus, Ukraine, and Siberia staged guerrilla campaigns, sabotaging railways, ambushing supply convoys, and assassinating Nazi officials. These fighters, often operating with minimal resources, relied on their intimate knowledge of the terrain and the support of local populations to continue their struggle. Despite their efforts, the resistance movements were unable to reclaim significant territory. The vastness of the former Soviet Union worked against them, as Nazi forces could isolate and overwhelm insurgent groups before they could consolidate their gains. Moreover, the brutality of Nazi reprisals, entire villages were massacred in response to partisan attacks, created an atmosphere of fear that stifled broader uprisings. The collapse of the Soviet Union also had ripple effects beyond its borders. Without the USSR as a counterweight to Nazi Germany, the balance of power in Eurasia shifted entirely in favor of the Axis powers. Central Asia, once a region of Soviet control, became a contested zone between Germany and Japan. Both powers sought to exploit its resources, particularly its oil fields, leading to tensions that would strain the Axis alliance in the years to come. For the people of the former Soviet Union, life under Nazi rule was a grim reality of survival. The dreams of socialism and industrial progress that had defined the USSR were replaced by a nightmarish existence of forced labor, starvation, and cultural annihilation. The collapse of the Soviet Union had not only reshaped the political map of the region but also extinguished a way of life for millions. By the late 1950s, the Nazi regime's control over the former Soviet Union remained firm but fragile. The sheer scale of the territory, combined with the relentless resistance of its people, created logistical and political challenges that even the Reich struggled to manage. While Hitler's vision of an Aryan-dominated East had become a reality on paper, the practicalities of maintaining such an empire revealed the limits of Nazi power. The collapse of the Soviet Union had marked a decisive victory for the Axis powers, but it also planted the seeds of their eventual unraveling. The subjugation of such a vast and diverse region required immense resources and constant vigilance, creating vulnerabilities that resistance movements and rival powers could exploit. The Axis had won the war, but the battle for control was far from over. In the aftermath of an Axis victory in World War II, the world's cultural landscape underwent a profound transformation. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan sought to reshape global society in their own images, imposing their ideologies on art, education, media, and religion. What emerged was a cultural order marked by censorship, propaganda, and the systematic erasure of traditions deemed incompatible with Axis ideals. Yet, beneath the surface, resistance to cultural domination simmered, preserving fragments of a suppressed world. Nazi Germany's approach to culture was rooted in the regime's obsession with racial purity and Aryan supremacy. The Reich sought to purge Europe of degenerate art and replace it with works that glorified Germanic heritage, militarism, and Hitler's vision of a thousand-year Reich. Museums were emptied of modernist, Jewish, and Slavic art, with paintings by artists like Picasso, Chagall, and Kandinsky either destroyed or sold to fund the Nazi regime. In their place, galleries displayed neoclassical works that celebrated the Aryan body and the mythologized Germanic past. Cinema became a powerful tool of propaganda under Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Films like Triumph of the Will and Olympia, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, became the standard for Nazi aesthetics, blending grandiose imagery with subtle ideological messaging. After the Axis victory, these techniques were exported across occupied Europe, with local filmmakers co-opted or replaced by German propagandists. The new wave of cinema glorified the Axis military conquests, demonized resistance movements, and celebrated the supposed benevolence of Nazi rule. Literature was tightly controlled. Books by Jewish, communist, and other undesirable authors were burned in mass ceremonies, and libraries were restocked with works that adhered to Nazi ideology. Fictional stories were rewritten to reflect Aryan values, while history books were heavily edited to erase contributions by non-Germanic cultures. In schools, children were taught a curriculum that emphasized racial superiority, loyalty to the Führer, and the triumph of the Reich. Across Europe, entire generations grew up immersed in a worldview designed to ensure their unwavering allegiance to Nazi ideals. The Japanese Empire's cultural transformation was similarly pervasive but took on a different character. In the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan portrayed itself as the liberator of Asia, freeing the region from Western imperialism. However, this narrative masked the empire's efforts to erase local traditions and impose Japanese culture. In Korea and Taiwan, the Japanese government implemented policies of forced assimilation. Korean and Taiwanese children were required to adopt Japanese names, speak only Japanese in schools, and pledge loyalty to the emperor. Traditional Korean and Chinese festivals were banned, replaced by celebrations of Japanese imperial achievements. Indigenous religions were suppressed, while Shinto shrines were erected across occupied territories as symbols of Japanese dominance. In Southeast Asia, cultural suppression was more strategic. While Japan tolerated certain local traditions to maintain order, it systematically dismantled symbols of Western influence, such as Christian churches and English-language schools. Japanese films, literature, and art flooded the region, promoting the ideals of imperial loyalty and the superiority of Japanese culture. Propaganda highlighted Japan's technological and military prowess, fostering a sense of inevitability about its rule. The transformation of culture under the Axis powers extended to architecture and urban planning. In Germany, Hitler's vision for the Reich was brought to life by architect Albert Speer, who oversaw the redesign of Berlin into Germania, a sprawling capital of monumental buildings and grand avenues. This architectural style, characterized by its stark symmetry and scale, was replicated across the empire, from Paris to Warsaw. Cities were reshaped to erase traces of local history, replacing them with structures that reflected Nazi dominance. In Japan, urban centers like Tokyo and Seoul were transformed to showcase imperial power. Traditional wooden structures were replaced by modern concrete and steel buildings, while streets were redesigned to accommodate military parades and industrial transport. Japanese architects combined elements of traditional design with modern engineering, creating a unique style that symbolized the empire's vision of progress. Music, too, was conscripted into the service of the Axis regimes. In Nazi Germany, jazz, swing, and other genres associated with African American and Jewish communities were banned, replaced by classical music and militaristic compositions that glorified the Reich. The works of composers like Wagner, Beethoven, and Strauss were elevated as symbols of Aryan culture. In Japan, traditional music was celebrated, but it was often repurposed to serve imperial propaganda. Marching songs and patriotic anthems became staples of public life, reinforcing loyalty to the emperor. Despite the overwhelming control exerted by the Axis powers, cultural resistance persisted. In occupied Europe, underground writers, artists, and musicians worked in secret to preserve their traditions and defy Nazi censorship. In Paris, a clandestine network of artists continued to create modernist works, smuggling them to neutral nations for safekeeping. In Poland, resistance fighters printed banned books and staged secret performances of plays and music that celebrated their heritage. In Japan's territories, resistance took on a similar form. In Korea, secret schools taught children the Korean language and history, defying Japanese assimilation policies. Folk songs and dances were preserved in rural areas, away from the watchful eyes of imperial authorities. In China, underground theaters performed plays that critiqued Japanese rule, using allegory and symbolism to evade censorship. The transformation of culture under the Axis powers was one of their most insidious weapons, as it sought not only to control territories but to reshape the minds and identities of their people. Yet, the resilience of human creativity and the enduring power of cultural heritage ensured that Axis domination was never complete. Beneath the surface of their empires, suppressed voices continued to sing, write, and create, preserving the essence of what the Axis sought to destroy. As the 1960s approached, the cracks in the Axis cultural order began to grow. Resistance movements became bolder, using culture as a weapon to rally support and inspire defiance. The Axis regimes, while technologically and militarily dominant, faced the realization that true control over a people's spirit could never be fully achieved. The Axis powers' victory in World War II not only redefined borders and economies but also reshaped societies at their core. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan implemented sweeping changes to governance, education, and daily life, creating a rigid social order built on hierarchy, obedience, and ideology. Their vision extended beyond mere control. They sought to construct a world in which their values were immutable, woven into the very fabric of existence. In Nazi Germany's Greater Reich, the social order was strictly stratified according to race and loyalty to the state. At the apex stood the Aryan elite, deemed the pinnacle of humanity by Nazi racial ideology. Citizenship was not a right but a privilege reserved for those who could prove their racial purity and unwavering loyalty to the Führer. Those deemed undesirable, Jews, Slavs, Romani, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others, were excluded entirely, their lives reduced to servitude, displacement, or extermination. The Reich's racial hierarchy extended into all aspects of life. Marriage and reproduction were heavily regulated by the state, with programs like Lebensborn promoting the birth of Aryan children. Women were celebrated as mothers of the Reich, their roles confined to child-rearing and homemaking in service of the state's expansionist ambitions. Men, meanwhile, were expected to embody martial virtues, serving in the military or laboring in industries vital to the Reich. Education became a tool of indoctrination. From a young age, children were immersed in Nazi ideology through schools that prioritized racial theory, history glorifying Germanic conquests, and physical fitness to prepare them for military service. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls replaced traditional youth organizations, ensuring that every child grew up with an unwavering allegiance to the Nazi Party. Critical thinking and dissent were systematically eradicated, replaced by a cult of personality around Adolf Hitler and an acceptance of the Reich's eternal rule. In the occupied territories, the new social order was even more brutal. Slavic populations were subjugated as second-class laborers, their lives valued only insofar as they served the Reich's needs. Entire towns were razed to make way for German settlers, who were granted privileged access to housing, education, and resources. In some cases, young children with Aryan features were forcibly taken from their families and raised as Germans, erasing their cultural heritage in the name of racial purity. Imperial Japan's new social order shared similarities with that of Nazi Germany but was rooted in its own traditions and imperial ideology. At the center of Japan's system was the emperor, revered as a divine figure whose authority was absolute. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was presented as a harmonious community of Asian nations united under Japan's leadership. In reality, it was a rigid hierarchy with Japan at the top and all other nations relegated to subservient roles. In Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria, Japanese officials imposed assimilation policies designed to erase local identities and replace them with imperial loyalty. Children were educated in Japanese, and the histories of their own cultures were rewritten to emphasize their supposed inferiority to Japan. Traditional family structures were undermined by state interventions that promoted loyalty to the emperor above all else. Resistance to these policies was met with swift and brutal reprisals, including imprisonment, torture, and execution. The Co-Prosperity Sphere's social order extended to the labor force. In Southeast Asia, workers were conscripted into massive infrastructure projects, such as railways, mines, and factories, under conditions that mirrored slavery. The Japanese military enforced strict discipline, with harsh punishments for those who resisted or failed to meet quotas. Indigenous populations were often displaced to make way for Japanese settlers, who were given preferential treatment in housing and access to resources. Gender roles in Japan's empire were heavily influenced by traditional Confucian and Shinto values. Women were expected to support the empire as dutiful wives and mothers, their lives centered on family and community. However, many were also exploited as comfort women, forced into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers, a practice that underscored the empire's brutal treatment of conquered peoples. the new social order imposed by the Axis powers was reinforced by surveillance and propaganda. In both Germany and Japan, citizens were encouraged to report neighbors, colleagues, and even family members suspected of disloyalty. Informant networks created a pervasive atmosphere of fear, ensuring that dissent was quashed before it could spread. Mass rallies, parades, and ceremonies celebrated the regime's achievements, fostering a sense of unity and inevitability about their rule. Despite the oppressive nature of the Axis social order, cracks began to appear as the years wore on. The rigid hierarchies and constant surveillance bred resentment among the subjugated populations, fueling resistance movements and underground networks. Even within the Axis empires, dissent quietly grew. Some Germans and Japanese, particularly those in the scientific and intellectual communities, began to question the morality of their regimes and sought ways to undermine them from within. In occupied territories, the subjugated populations found ways to resist the new social order. In Eastern Europe, underground schools preserved Slavic languages and traditions, defying Nazi assimilation policies. In Korea and Taiwan, secret societies formed to teach banned histories and celebrate indigenous culture. These acts of defiance, though small in scale, kept alive the hope of liberation. By the late 1950s, the Axis powers' social order remained outwardly strong but was increasingly fragile beneath the surface. The sheer scope of their empires made it difficult to maintain control, and the constant need to suppress rebellion drained resources and morale. The rigid hierarchies they had imposed created divisions even within their own societies, as those excluded from privilege sought ways to challenge the status quo. The new social order of the Axis powers was a testament to their ability to impose control on a vast scale. Yet, the resilience of human spirit and the enduring power of cultural identity hinted at the possibility that even the most oppressive systems could one day be dismantled. In the Axis-dominated world, science became both a tool of advancement and a weapon of control. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, unrestrained by ethical oversight, exploited their vast resources and subjected populations to horrific experiments in the pursuit of their ideological and military goals. The science of oppression defined this era, as breakthroughs in medicine, technology, and industry were achieved at the unimaginable cost of human suffering. Nazi Germany's scientific pursuits were driven by the regime's obsession with racial purity and military superiority. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler's SS and institutions like the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, human experimentation reached new depths of depravity. Concentration camps such as Auschwitz became laboratories where prisoners were subjected to brutal experiments. Twins were separated and tested by Joseph Mengele, who sought to understand genetic inheritance and manipulate it to produce perfect Aryans. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to hypothermia, infectious diseases, and toxic gases to test survival techniques and treatments for German soldiers. The results of these experiments were often presented as scientific achievements within the Reich, even as they caused untold suffering. Medical discoveries, such as advanced techniques for wound treatment and surgical innovations, were extracted from these inhumane practices. However, the pursuit of knowledge was secondary to the regime's ideological goals. Many experiments were carried out with no scientific purpose other than to affirm Nazi beliefs about racial inferiority or to dehumanize their victims further. In the industrial sector, Nazi scientists and engineers developed groundbreaking technologies that would reshape the 20th century. Rocketry, led by Wernher von Braun and the V-2 missile program, advanced rapidly with the use of enslaved laborers in subterranean factories like Mittelwerk. These missiles, initially designed for short-range attacks, were refined into intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of reaching targets thousands of miles away. The fear of Axis missile strikes became a constant in the post-war world, underscoring the moral compromises made in their development. The Nazis also pushed forward in nuclear research, achieving breakthroughs that allowed them to detonate their first atomic bomb in the late 1940s. This success cemented Germany's dominance in Europe and ensured that no rival could challenge its power without facing nuclear retaliation. However, the production of these weapons relied heavily on forced labor and environmental destruction, as uranium mines in Africa and Eastern Europe were worked under deadly conditions. Imperial Japan's scientific endeavors mirrored those of Nazi Germany but were often driven by the empire's militaristic and territorial ambitions. Unit 731, the notorious Biological and Chemical Weapons Research Unit, continued its activities across the co-prosperity sphere. In occupied territories like China and Manchuria, entire villages were subjected to experiments involving anthrax, plague, and other deadly pathogens. Victims were intentionally infected and monitored as diseases ravaged their bodies, all in the name of developing weapons to secure Japan's dominance. Chemical weapons developed by Japanese scientists were used in Southeast Asia, often under the guise of counterinsurgency operations. Forests and farmlands were sprayed with toxins to root out guerrilla fighters, while civilian populations were exposed to experimental gases. The results were devastating, leaving scars on the land and its people that would last for generations. In the medical field, Japanese doctors conducted forced sterilizations and surgeries on prisoners to explore eugenics and population control. Women in occupied territories were subjected to experiments aimed at increasing birth rates among Japanese settlers while suppressing reproduction in local populations. These experiments, like those in Nazi Germany, were carried out with complete disregard for the lives of their subjects. The technological ambitions of Imperial Japan also extended to naval and aviation advancements. Japan pioneered miniaturized nuclear weapons for use on submarines and aircraft, creating a fleet of stealthy delivery systems capable of devastating enemy targets. These innovations were built on the backs of enslaved workers, who toiled in extreme conditions to produce the materials and components needed for Japan's war machine. The Axis powers' lack of ethical constraints allowed them to achieve significant technological and medical advancements, but these came at a profound moral cost. The widespread use of human subjects in experiments and the exploitation of labor created a scientific culture devoid of humanity. Discoveries that could have been used to improve lives were instead weaponized, perpetuating the suffering of millions. The long-term consequences of the Axis science of oppression extended beyond their immediate victims. Environmental destruction from unregulated mining, chemical testing, and nuclear experimentation left entire regions uninhabitable. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors of forced labor and experimentation created generational scars, while the propaganda used to justify these practices entrenched ideologies of superiority and dehumanization. Despite the Axis powers' dominance, their scientific advancements did not go unchallenged. In secret, scientists and intellectuals within the Reich and the co-prosperity sphere began to question the regime's methods and motivations. Some defected to neutral nations, bringing with them knowledge of Axis technology and exposing the atrocities committed in its pursuit. Others sabotaged research projects from within, slowing the development of new weapons and spreading dissent among their peers. By the late 1950s, the cracks in the Axis scientific empire were beginning to show. The unsustainable exploitation of resources, combined with resistance from occupied populations and dissident scientists, created vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. The regime's reliance on fear and repression to maintain their control over the scientific community further alienated the very minds they needed to sustain their dominance. The science of oppression, while central to the Axis powers' rise, also sowed the seeds of their eventual decline. The technologies they developed, born of cruelty and exploitation, became symbols of their inhumanity, rallying resistance against their rule. As the world braced for what lay ahead, it became clear that even the most advanced machines of war and control could not extinguish the resilience of the human spirit. By the late 1950s, The Axis powers appeared to stand unchallenged, their empires spanning continents and their technological dominance unassailable. But beneath the surface of their monolithic regimes, cracks were beginning to show. The sheer scale of their territories, the inherent contradictions of their ideologies, and the resistance of subjugated populations created vulnerabilities that even their immense power could not conceal. The world Hitler and Hirohito had built was vast, but it was far from stable. One of the most significant sources of tension lay within the Axis alliance itself. Germany and Japan, united by a shared desire to dismantle the old world order, were now rivals in shaping the new one. The division of Eurasia, once agreed upon during the height of the war, became a contentious issue as the two powers expanded their ambitions. Central Asia, with its vast oil reserves and strategic importance, was a flashpoint. Nazi troops clashed with Japanese-backed militias in regions like Kazakhstan, while both powers sought to control trade routes running through the area. The rivalry extended to the Pacific, where Japan's dominance threatened German interests in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. German naval patrols, initially cooperative with their Japanese counterparts, began to encroach on Japanese-controlled waters, prompting tense standoffs. These territorial disputes strained diplomatic relations, with both sides accusing the other of undermining the alliance. The Axis powers' economies, built on exploitation and forced labor, also showed signs of strain. The vast territories under their control required immense resources to govern, and the reliance on enslaved populations created inefficiencies and instability. In Eastern Europe, Nazi administrators faced growing resistance from laborers who sabotaged factories and infrastructure. Rail lines were disrupted, shipments disappeared, and productivity declined, forcing the Reich to divert military resources to maintain order. In the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan's economy was similarly overextended. The relentless extraction of resources from colonies like Korea, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia fueled industrial growth in Japan but left local economies in ruin. Famine and poverty became widespread, leading to unrest that even Japan's brutal military crackdowns could not entirely suppress. Resistance movements in territories like the Philippines, Malaya, and Burma targeted mines, plantations, and ports, disrupting the flow of resources to Japan and undermining its economic stability. Resistance was not confined to the periphery. Within the core territories of the Axis powers, dissent began to grow. In Nazi Germany, a new generation of intellectuals, scientists, and even military officers quietly questioned the regime's policies. Some were motivated by ethical concerns, horrified by the atrocities committed in the name of the Reich. Others saw the inefficiencies and corruption within the Nazi bureaucracy as a threat to Germany's long-term survival. Underground networks of dissent emerged, even in the heart of Berlin. Former Wehrmacht officers who had been sidelined during Hitler's consolidation of power began to organize in secret, hoping to restore a semblance of rational governance to the Reich. These groups, though fragmented and closely monitored by the Gestapo, represented a growing undercurrent of opposition that the regime could not ignore. In Japan, similar cracks appeared. The samurai-inspired militarism that had united the empire began to falter under the weight of its contradictions. Younger generations, educated in the imperial system but exposed to the suffering of occupied populations, began to question the legitimacy of Japan's rule. Among the Zaibatsu, the powerful industrial conglomerates that formed the backbone of Japan's economy, whispers of dissent grew louder as economic instability threatened their profits. The Axis powers' reliance on surveillance and repression to maintain control created additional vulnerabilities. The Gestapo in Germany and the Kempeitai in Japan operated vast networks of informants, but the sheer scale of their empires made it impossible to monitor everyone. Resistance movements exploited these gaps, infiltrating Axis institutions and spreading discontent among soldiers, workers, and civilians. Technological advancements, once a cornerstone of Axis dominance, also became a double-edged sword. The sophisticated infrastructure and weaponry that had secured their empires required constant maintenance and resources, which were increasingly difficult to obtain. Sabotage by resistance fighters further strained these systems, while rivalries within the Axis powers complicated their ability to coordinate technological development. The pressure of resistance and internal dissent was compounded by the inherent instability of totalitarian governance. Hitler's Reich, for all its outward strength, depended heavily on the Führer's personal authority. As Hitler aged and his health declined, power struggles emerged among his inner circle. Himmler, Göring, and Speer jockeyed for influence, their competing visions for the future of the Reich creating divisions within the Nazi leadership. In Japan, the divine authority of the emperor masked similar fractures within the military and political elite. Rival factions within the imperial army and navy clashed over strategy and resource allocation, while civilian leaders struggled to balance the demands of the military with the growing discontent of the population. The rigid hierarchy that had once unified Japan now stifled its ability to adapt to new challenges. By the early 1960s, the cracks in the Axis empires had become impossible to ignore. Resistance movements grew bolder, launching coordinated attacks on Axis infrastructure and rallying support from neutral nations like the United States. Within the Axis territories, whispers of rebellion turned into open defiance as subjugated populations seized opportunities to challenge their oppressors. The fragile balance between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan teetered on the edge of collapse. Their alliance, once the foundation of their global dominance, now threatened to become their undoing. As the world watched, the question was no longer whether the Axis powers could be challenged, but whether their empires could withstand the weight of their own contradictions. By the early 1960s, the world shaped by an Axis victory in World War II stood at a precarious crossroads. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had carved the globe into vast empires, their dominance secured through technological superiority, military might, and oppressive control. Yet, the cracks in their regimes, fueled by internal strife, resistance movements, and the unsustainable nature of their systems, threatened to unravel everything they had built. Even as the Axis powers appeared invincible, the long-term consequences of their dark victory began to reveal themselves. One of the most profound legacies of the Axis triumph was the psychological and cultural impact on the world's populations. For those living under Nazi rule in Europe, daily life had been reduced to a grim struggle for survival. Entire cultures and identities had been systematically erased. In Eastern Europe, Slavic populations were displaced or exterminated to make way for German settlers, leaving behind a scarred landscape of ghost towns and abandoned villages. The Holocaust had annihilated millions of Jewish people, Romani, and other minorities, and its survivors lived in a world that had turned its back on them. In Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a similar erasure of identity and culture had taken place. Local traditions were suppressed, and entire generations grew up under the shadow of Japanese imperialism. Resistance was crushed with unrelenting brutality, and collaboration was often the only means of survival. Yet, even among those who conformed, resentment simmered, passed down through families and communities as a quiet defiance that the empire could not extinguish. The global economic order was another enduring legacy of the Axis victory. Both Germany and Japan had established economies that thrived on exploitation, forced labor, and resource extraction. While this system had initially fueled their rise, by the 1960s, its limitations were clear. Resource shortages, sabotage by resistance movements, and the inefficiencies of slave labor strained both empires. Economies in subjugated territories were hollowed out, their industries repurposed solely for the benefit of their overlords. In this unequal world, wealth and prosperity were concentrated in the Axis heartlands, while poverty and desperation defined life for the majority. The geopolitical landscape was dominated by the tension between the Axis powers and the few remaining neutral nations, particularly the United States. Although officially disengaged, the US had become a hub for exiled leaders, dissident scientists, and underground resistance movements. American policymakers, wary of directly confronting the Axis, instead supported covert operations aimed at undermining the regimes. This indirect conflict, marked by espionage, sabotage, and propaganda, hinted at the possibility of a second global struggle, one in which the remaining free nations would attempt to reclaim what had been lost. The Axis alliance itself began to fray under the weight of its contradictions. The rivalry between Germany and Japan, once tempered by their shared goals, had escalated into an open contest for dominance. Disputes over resources in Central Asia, influence in the Middle East, and control of the Indian Ocean created a Cold War between the two powers. While both sides maintained the pretense of unity, their competition in military buildup and territorial expansion signaled that war between them was no longer a question of if, but when. Within the Axis territories, resistance movements continued to grow. These underground networks, though fragmented and under constant threat, coordinated acts of defiance that disrupted supply lines, sabotaged infrastructure, and kept the dream of liberation alive. In Europe, the Polish resistance staged daring attacks on Nazi installations, while in Asia, guerrilla fighters in the Philippines and Burma reclaimed swaths of territory from Japanese forces. The Axis regimes expended vast resources to suppress these uprisings, creating a cycle of repression and rebellion that further strained their empires. The cultural legacy of the Axis victory was equally complex. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had attempted to reshape the world in their image, but their impositions were met with quiet acts of cultural preservation. In secret, forbidden books were read, suppressed songs were sung, and banned traditions were passed down to younger generations. These acts of defiance ensured that, even under the harshest conditions, the Axis could not fully erase the identities of those they sought to dominate. For the Axis powers themselves, the legacy of their victory was not only one of dominance but of paranoia and insecurity. The need to maintain control over vast territories required constant vigilance and repression. Surveillance states flourished, with informants embedded in every community and dissidents hunted relentlessly. Yet, this very surveillance created an atmosphere of mistrust that extended even to the highest levels of leadership. In Nazi Germany, the absence of clear succession plans led to internal power struggles as Hitler's health declined. Factions within the Reich vied for control, their competing visions for the future creating divisions that weakened the regime. In Japan, similar tensions emerged as the rigid hierarchy of the imperial system clashed with the realities of governing a vast and diverse empire. The Axis powers' technological dominance, while formidable, also carried unintended consequences. The development of nuclear weapons, advanced rocketry, and biological warfare created a perpetual state of fear among both their enemies and their own populations. The world had entered a new era of existential threat, where the tools of war could obliterate entire cities in moments. By the late 1960s, the legacy of the Axis victory had become one of unfulfilled promises and growing instability. The empires they had built were vast but brittle, their foundations eroded by resistance, rivalry, and the unsustainable nature of their systems. For the millions who lived under their rule, hope persisted, not because the Axis seemed weak, but because history had shown that even the mightiest empires could fall. As the world teetered on the edge of a new conflict, the lessons of the Axis victory remained stark reminders of what unchecked ambition, ideology, and power could create and destroy. The legacy of this dark victory was not only a cautionary tale but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, which refused to be extinguished even in the face of unimaginable oppression. The winter of 1941 was brutal on the Eastern Front. Snowstorms swept across the Soviet plains, and temperatures plummeted to levels that froze fuel in tanks and left soldiers shivering in makeshift trenches. But in this alternate timeline, a critical decision changed the course of history. Adolf Hitler, dismissing his generals' protests, delayed Operation Barbarossa by only a few weeks instead of the fateful months it took in our reality. The German forces, reinforced with additional panzer divisions and supplied by an early discovery of Soviet oil reserves in Ukraine, launched their assault with devastating precision. By the time the snows came, Moscow was surrounded. The fall of Moscow in December 1941 shattered the Soviet Union. Stalin, cut off from his command center, fled to the Urals, but the Red Army, demoralized and leaderless, began to fracture. With its industrial heartland under German control, the USSR was unable to mount a significant counteroffensive. By mid-1942, the Nazi banner hung over the Kremlin, and Hitler declared the Soviet Union effectively dissolved. The vast resources of Eastern Europe and Siberia were now at the Nazis' disposal, fueling the Third Reich's war machine and emboldening Hitler's vision of a global empire. On the Western Front, the United Kingdom stood as the last bastion of resistance in Europe. The fall of France in 1940 had been a crushing blow, and now, without the Soviets to divide German attention, Britain faced the full might of the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine. In this alternate reality, the Nazis' strategy shifted. Hitler, rather than initiating an immediate invasion, opted for a sustained campaign of aerial bombardment and economic strangulation. With German U-boats blockading supply routes and devastating RAF airfields, Britain's lifelines began to fail. By 1943, under relentless pressure and growing domestic unrest, the British government sued for peace. Churchill, unwilling to capitulate, was forced to step aside, leaving a neutral but defeated Britain to endure a puppet regime under German influence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched in horror as Europe fell. Japan, emboldened by the swift Axis victories, launched a more aggressive Pacific campaign. By the time Pearl Harbor came under attack, the Japanese fleet had already seized Midway and was preparing for an invasion of Hawaii. The United States, now engaged on two fronts, faced a grim reality. Its allies in Europe were gone, and its own forces were stretched thin. Isolationist voices grew louder in Congress, arguing that the U.S. should focus on defending its own shores rather than engaging in a global war it was unlikely to win. By 1944, the Axis powers controlled nearly all of Europe, large swaths of Asia, and the Pacific. The Nazi regime, flush with resources and technological advancements, launched a series of devastating new weapons, including the first operational jet fighters and long-range rockets capable of striking American cities. In this world, Hitler's nuclear program did not falter. By 1945, the Nazis had successfully tested an atomic bomb in the Ural Mountains. The demonstration of such destructive power brought the world to its knees. The United States, under President Charles Lindbergh, elected on a platform of neutrality in 1944, signed a non-aggression pact with Germany and Japan, effectively ending its involvement in the war. The Holocaust, intensified by the lack of Allied resistance, continued unchecked, exterminating millions more. Camps expanded eastward, into the conquered Soviet territories, and the machinery of genocide operated on a scale far beyond what history remembers. By the time 1950 dawned, the world was unrecognizable. The Greater Germanic Empire spanned from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains, with plans to colonize Siberia and eradicate any trace of Slavic culture. Japan ruled much of the Pacific, including China, Southeast Asia, and Australia, enforcing its will with ruthless efficiency. The dream of global fascism had become a nightmarish reality, its grip enforced by propaganda, surveillance, and unspeakable violence. But cracks were already beginning to form. Resistance movements, though fragmented and outgunned, persisted in the shadows. Scientists and intellectuals fled Axis territories, carrying with them whispers of plans to strike back. And in the hearts of those living under occupation, a spark of defiance refused to be extinguished. This was the world of 1950, a world reshaped by a single turning point. A world where the Axis powers had won. By the mid-1950s, the Axis powers had carved the world into three sprawling spheres of influence. Nazi Germany controlled Europe and much of Eurasia, Japan dominated East Asia and the Pacific, and Italy, though overshadowed by its more powerful allies, governed parts of North Africa and the Mediterranean. The former allies were reduced to isolated holdouts, their influence diminished, their populations living under regimes of fear or reluctant neutrality. In Europe, the Greater Germanic Empire ruled with an iron fist. The continent's map had been redrawn, with Germany annexing vast swaths of land in the east and establishing puppet states across Western and Southern Europe. The United Kingdom, once the Axis' fiercest opponent, had fallen into collaboration after its surrender. The British Isles, now a neutralized state under the leadership of a pro-German regime, served as a grim example of how resistance could be extinguished through economic blockades, propaganda, and military intimidation. Former allies like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were similarly subjugated, their governments reduced to mere administrative branches of Berlin. Eastern Europe faced the harshest realities of Axis domination. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan race, was implemented with brutal efficiency. The Slavic populations of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia were decimated or enslaved, their lands repurposed for German settlers. Entire villages were erased, their inhabitants shipped to labor camps or extermination facilities. Nazi ideology shaped every facet of life in the occupied East, with policies aimed at erasing local cultures and histories. The region became a vast colony, its resources extracted to fuel the Nazi war machine and its lands transformed into the agricultural and industrial backbone of the Reich. Japan's empire, meanwhile, extended from China to the Pacific Islands and down to Australia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, initially presented as a liberation from Western colonial powers, revealed itself as another oppressive empire. In China, puppet regimes enforced Japanese control, while dissent was met with overwhelming force. The infamous Unit 731 continued its experiments on prisoners, advancing Japanese medical and chemical warfare capabilities at horrific human costs. Southeast Asia, rich in rubber, oil, and tin, became a resource hub for Japan, its people exploited as laborers. In Australia, a Japanese occupation government imposed strict racial hierarchies, segregating the indigenous population and European-descended Australians under a system reminiscent of apartheid. In the Mediterranean and parts of Africa, Italy's ambitions faltered in the shadow of Germany and Japan. Mussolini's regime struggled to maintain control over its territories, which included Libya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Italian colonies, while brutal in their exploitation, lacked the industrial and administrative efficiency of their Axis partners. Rome remained a symbolic rather than strategic center of Axis power, its influence waning as Hitler's vision for a German-dominated world overshadowed Mussolini's dreams of a Roman revival. Across the Atlantic, the Americas were divided by ideology and geography. The United States, under a policy of neutrality established in the late 1940s, remained a superpower in potential but refrained from engaging the Axis militarily. President Lindbergh's administration focused on fortifying the Western Hemisphere, negotiating with Germany and Japan to maintain peace while preparing for the possibility of future conflict. South America, meanwhile, became a patchwork of pro-Axis regimes and neutral states. Countries like Brazil and Argentina, with pre-existing fascist sympathies, aligned themselves with Germany and Japan, receiving economic and military support in exchange for their loyalty. The division of the world into Axis spheres of influence created a new global order, but it was far from stable. The Axis alliance, forged out of shared ambition, began to strain under the weight of competing interests. Germany and Japan, while maintaining outward unity, saw their visions for the future diverge. Germany's dominance over Europe and its push into the resource-rich territories of Central Asia encroached on Japan's interests in the region. In Africa, Italian administrators resented German interference in their colonial affairs, leading to tensions between Berlin and Rome. Meanwhile, resistance simmered beneath the surface. In the shadows of cities like Warsaw, Paris, and Shanghai, underground networks of fighters, spies, and dissidents waged a silent war against their occupiers. In the United States, public opinion began to shift as news of Axis atrocities trickled through smuggled reports and escaped refugees. Across the globe, whispers of rebellion grew louder, and the Axis regimes found themselves increasingly consumed by the need to maintain control over their vast territories. The division of the world after the Axis victory was not merely physical but psychological. The ideals of democracy, freedom, and equality, once championed by the Allies, were suppressed but not extinguished. For every occupied city and conquered nation, there were those who refused to accept the new order. Their resistance, though fragmented and perilous, carried the hope that the Axis dominance would one day crumble under its own weight. As the 1950s drew to a close, the world stood at a crossroads. The Axis powers appeared invincible, their banners flying over half the globe. Yet the cracks in their empire were beginning to show, hinting at the possibility of a future shaped not by the victors of World War II, but by those who dared to resist them. By the late 1950s, life within the Greater Germanic Empire bore little resemblance to the world that had existed before the Axis victory. Adolf Hitler's vision for a totalitarian state had been realized on an unprecedented scale, reshaping Europe, and much of Eurasia, into a society governed by fear, propaganda, and rigid social hierarchies. While the outward trappings of prosperity and order masked the realities of the regime, those living under Nazi rule experienced a world of unrelenting control, systemic brutality, and cultural erasure. In major cities like Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, the Nazi aesthetic was omnipresent. Towering government buildings, adorned with swastikas and massive statues, symbolized the empire's power and permanence. Hitler's grand architectural plans, spearheaded by Albert Speer, were brought to life with the forced labor of millions. Berlin, renamed Germania, stood as the empire's capital and centerpiece, a sprawling metropolis of stark, monumental structures designed to project dominance and awe. The city's transformation came at a staggering human cost, with entire neighborhoods razed and their inhabitants displaced to make way for Hitler's dream. Daily life in the Reich was a carefully orchestrated performance. Citizens were bombarded with propaganda through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films, all controlled by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Messages glorified the Nazi Party, celebrated the empire's victories, and vilified enemies both real and imagined. Education was restructured to indoctrinate the youth, with schools emphasizing racial purity, obedience to the Führer, and the supposed superiority of Germanic culture. For those who conformed, the regime offered a sense of stability and purpose. Middle-class Germans, in particular, enjoyed the benefits of the Reich's economic policies, which focused on autarky and the exploitation of conquered territories. Consumer goods, once scarce during the war, became more widely available, though much of this prosperity was built on the suffering of enslaved laborers in the East. For some, the illusion of order and progress obscured the atrocities taking place just beyond the empire's borders. In the occupied territories, life was far bleaker. Eastern Europe, designated as living space for the Aryan race, became the site of widespread ethnic cleansing. The remaining Slavic populations were subjected to forced labor, with millions sent to work in factories, mines, and agricultural estates under inhumane conditions. Cities like Warsaw and Kiev were depopulated and repurposed for German settlers, their histories erased in an effort to remake the region in the Nazi image. Resistance was met with swift and brutal reprisals, including mass executions, deportations, and the destruction of entire villages. For the Jewish people, the Holocaust continued unabated. With no Allied forces to liberate concentration camps, the Nazis expanded their genocidal operations. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became central to the final solution, processing millions more victims from across Europe. The extermination program extended into the newly conquered territories of the Soviet Union, where mobile killing units and newly constructed camps accelerated the pace of genocide. By the 1960s, Jewish communities in Europe had been almost entirely eradicated, along with Romani populations, political dissidents, LGBTQ individuals, and other groups deemed undesirable by the regime. The surveillance state reached unprecedented levels under the Gestapo, and SS informants were embedded in every community, and the slightest hint of dissent could result in arrest, torture, or execution. Families lived in fear of neighbors, colleagues, and even relatives, as loyalty to the state was prioritized above all else. The concept of privacy all but disappeared, with homes, workplaces, and even public spaces subject to constant monitoring. Cultural life under the Reich was carefully curated to align with Nazi ideology. Music, art, and literature were purged of influences considered degenerate, such as modernism, jazz, and anything associated with Jewish or Slavic traditions. Instead, the regime promoted works that glorified Germanic folklore, classical forms, and militaristic themes. The film industry flourished under directors like Leni Riefenstahl, producing grand spectacles that celebrated the Nazi Party and reinforced the regime's mythology. While life in the Reich appeared orderly to the outside world, cracks in the system were evident to those who looked closely. The economy, heavily reliant on plundered resources and slave labor, was unsustainable in the long term. The rigid social hierarchy bred resentment among conquered populations and even within the ranks of the German elite. Resistance movements, though fragmented and outgunned, continued to disrupt the regime's operations through sabotage, espionage, and underground networks. Despite the oppression, hope persisted. In secret, dissidents circulated banned literature, hosted clandestine meetings, and planned acts of defiance. For those living under Nazi rule, resistance was not only a fight for survival but a declaration of humanity in the face of tyranny. These small acts of rebellion, though seemingly insignificant in the grand scheme, kept alive the possibility of a future beyond the Reich. As the 1960s approached, the empire Hitler had built appeared unassailable. Yet the cracks in its foundations hinted at a growing instability. Beneath the surface, the weight of maintaining such a vast and oppressive system threatened to overwhelm even the most meticulously planned regime. The question was not if the Reich would fall, but when, and at what cost. As Europe and much of Asia fell under the grip of the Axis powers, the Americas faced a stark choice: resist or accommodate. The United States, once a beacon of democratic ideals and a formidable military power, was forced to reckon with a new geopolitical reality. Isolated from its former European allies and stretched thin by Japan's dominance in the Pacific, the U.S. pivoted inward, prioritizing its own survival. Meanwhile, Latin America became a battleground for influence, with pro-Axis factions gaining ground in several nations, further threatening the continent's stability. By the late 1940s, the United States had adopted a policy of strategic neutrality. After the fall of Britain and the Soviet Union, public sentiment shifted decisively against continued involvement in the global conflict. Charles Lindbergh, an outspoken isolationist, rose to political prominence and won the 1944 presidential election on a platform of peace through disengagement. Under his administration, the U.S. negotiated a non-aggression pact with Germany and Japan, effectively conceding Axis dominance in Europe and Asia in exchange for guarantees of American territorial integrity. While the U.S. remained formally independent, the terms of the pact imposed significant restrictions on its foreign policy and trade. The once mighty American economy, deprived of access to key markets in Europe and Asia, began to stagnate. German and Japanese industries, fueled by resources extracted from their empires, flooded the global market with goods, undermining American manufacturing. At the same time, German scientists, many of whom had fled to the US in the real timeline, remained in Europe, accelerating the Axis technological advantage. In Latin America, the Axis powers found fertile ground for expansion. Even before World War II, fascist movements had gained traction in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, fueled by economic instability and dissatisfaction with democratic governance. After the Axis victory, these movements grew stronger, supported by covert German and Japanese efforts to establish political and economic footholds. Argentina, under the leadership of Juan Perón, aligned itself closely with Germany, adopting many of the hallmarks of fascist governance. Nazi advisors helped reorganize Argentina's military and bureaucracy, while German businesses invested heavily in the country's industrial infrastructure. Buenos Aires became a hub for Axis influence in the Western Hemisphere, a symbol of the New World Order taking shape. Brazil, long seen as a potential rival to Argentina for regional dominance, found itself divided. While the government maintained nominal neutrality, pro-Axis factions gained influence in the military and business sectors. German and Japanese immigrants in Brazil formed cultural associations that became conduits for Axis propaganda, spreading the ideology of racial superiority and authoritarian rule. Other nations in the region, like Mexico and Venezuela, resisted Axis encroachment but faced immense pressure. Mexico, with its proximity to the US, became a critical partner in American efforts to maintain a buffer against Axis influence. Venezuela, rich in oil, found itself caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war, with German and Japanese interests vying for access to its resources. The Panama Canal, a strategic lifeline for the Americas, became a focal point of tension. The United States fortified the canal heavily, deploying troops and constructing advanced defenses to prevent Axis interference. Yet, the canal's significance also made it a target for sabotage and espionage, with German and Japanese agents infiltrating the region to disrupt American control. In Canada, the fall of Britain had profound implications. Cut off from its traditional ally and protector, Canada was forced to seek closer ties with the United States. However, this partnership was fraught with challenges, as Canadian leaders resisted American attempts to impose military and economic policies that prioritized U.S. interests. German propaganda sought to exploit these tensions, encouraging separatist movements in Quebec and other regions. As the Axis consolidated its influence in Latin America, resistance movements emerged, inspired by the ideals of freedom and democracy that had once defined the Western Hemisphere. These movements, though fragmented and underfunded, carried out acts of sabotage against Axis-aligned governments and businesses. In Argentina, dissidents formed underground networks to oppose Perón's regime, while in Brazil, workers organized strikes to protest pro-Axis policies. For the United States, the fate of the Americas was a constant source of anxiety. While Lindbergh's administration maintained a policy of neutrality, the growing Axis presence in the region posed an existential threat. Military planners warned of the possibility of a coordinated Axis invasion, using Latin America as a staging ground to attack the U.S. mainland. These fears prompted the U.S. to expand its military presence in the region, deploying troops to strategic locations like the Caribbean and Central America. By the mid-1950s, the Americas had become a microcosm of the larger global struggle between democracy and totalitarianism. While the United States and its allies clung to their independence, the shadow of the Axis loomed large. Latin America, once a region of diverse political systems and cultures, had become a battleground for competing ideologies, its future uncertain. As the Axis powers extended their reach across the globe, the question remained, could the Americas resist the tide, or would they too succumb to the new order? In the aftermath of the Axis victory, Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere evolved from a wartime ambition into a sprawling empire that dominated the Pacific and much of Asia. Initially framed as a movement to liberate Asian nations from Western colonial rule, the co-prosperity sphere became a brutal and exploitative regime. Under Japanese control, the region underwent profound political, social, and economic transformations, but these came at an extraordinary human cost. By the early 1950s, Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to Australia, encompassing China, Korea, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and parts of the Indian subcontinent. Each of these regions played a specific role in the empire's vision. China and Southeast Asia provided resources and labor, Korea served as an industrial and agricultural hub, and the Pacific Islands acted as strategic military outposts. Australia, occupied after the fall of the Allied forces in the Pacific, became the southernmost outpost of Japanese expansion, used for agriculture and as a base for further incursions into the region. The co-prosperity sphere was governed from Tokyo, where Japan's military elite and political leaders established a rigid hierarchy of control. Puppet governments were installed in many territories, including the Yuan Jingwei regime in China, which collaborated with Japanese authorities to suppress resistance. These governments, however, were little more than extensions of Tokyo's will, their power limited to enforcing Japanese policies. In China, the occupation was particularly harsh. Following the fall of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and the suppression of communist forces, Japan consolidated its control over the country. Cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing were heavily militarized, with Japanese troops patrolling the streets and enforcing strict curfews. The looting of resources, particularly coal, oil, and agricultural products, intensified, leaving millions of Chinese impoverished and malnourished. The use of forced labor became widespread throughout the co-prosperity sphere. Millions of Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, and Southeast Asians were conscripted to work in mines, factories, and construction projects under appalling conditions. The Burma-Thailand Railway, often called the Death Railway, became a symbol of this exploitation, as tens of thousands of laborers and prisoners of war died constructing the grueling jungle route. Japan's imperial ambitions were built on the backs of these workers, whose suffering was largely ignored by the regime. Cultural assimilation was another cornerstone of Japan's rule. In Korea, Japan imposed a policy of erasure, banning the Korean language in schools, replacing Korean names with Japanese ones, and forcing cultural conformity through state propaganda. Temples, statues, and historical sites that did not align with Japan's vision of its empire were destroyed or repurposed. A similar process unfolded in Taiwan and parts of Southeast Asia, where local traditions and languages were suppressed in favor of Japanese customs. Japan's control of the Pacific Ocean turned it into an impregnable fortress. The empire fortified islands like Guam, Saipan, and Midway, transforming them into bases equipped with airstrips, naval ports, and anti-aircraft defenses. These outposts ensured Japan's dominance over trade routes and made it nearly impossible for other powers, including the United States, to challenge its naval superiority. While Japan presented itself as a liberator, many Asian nations soon discovered that Japanese rule was as oppressive as, if not more so than, the Western colonial regimes it had replaced. In the Philippines, for example, initial celebrations of liberation from American control gave way to widespread resentment as Japanese forces imposed martial law, conscripted workers, and seized land. Resistance movements, such as the Hikbalahap guerrillas, persisted, though they were met with brutal reprisals. In Indonesia, Japan's occupation dismantled the Dutch colonial administration but replaced it with a system of forced labor and resource extraction. The Japanese co-opted nationalist leaders like Sukarno, using their influence to control the population. While Sukarno's collaboration laid the groundwork for future independence, it also deepened divisions within Indonesian society, as some viewed him as a traitor to the anti-colonial cause. Even in territories with historical ties to Japan, such as Korea and Taiwan, resentment toward Japanese rule grew. In Korea, underground resistance movements smuggled weapons and staged uprisings, while in Taiwan, indigenous populations rebelled against forced assimilation and exploitation. These acts of defiance were met with overwhelming force, as Japan's military crushed rebellions and executed dissidents to maintain control. Japan's dominance in the co-prosperity sphere extended to technological and military advancements. The empire heavily invested in aviation, naval technology, and infrastructure projects to solidify its control. Japan also pursued nuclear weapons research, hoping to match Germany's atomic capabilities and further secure its position as a global power. These technological developments came at the cost of human experimentation, particularly through the infamous Unit 731, which continued its atrocities in occupied territories, testing biological and chemical weapons on civilians. Despite its outward strength, the co-prosperity sphere was far from stable. The vast distances between territories, combined with the diversity of cultures and languages, made governance challenging. Resistance movements in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia strained Japanese resources, forcing the empire to divert troops and supplies to quell uprisings. Economic exploitation, while enriching Japan, impoverished its colonies, fostering widespread resentment that undermined the legitimacy of Japanese rule. By the late 1950s, cracks were beginning to show in Japan's imperial facade. The resistance movements grew bolder, staging coordinated attacks on Japanese infrastructure and military installations. Rivalries between Japan and Germany, particularly over resource-rich Central Asia, created tensions within the Axis alliance. And within Japan itself, discontent simmered among citizens who questioned the morality and sustainability of the empire's ambitions. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, once envisioned as a utopia of Asian unity, had become a dystopian reality of exploitation and oppression. While Japan's dominance appeared unshakable, the seeds of resistance and rebellion hinted at a future where the empire's grip might one day falter. The Axis victory in World War II marked the dawn of a new global economic system, one designed to fuel the ambitions of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. With vast territories under their control, the Axis powers reshaped trade routes, restructured industries, and exploited resources on an unprecedented scale. What emerged was an economy of extraction, subjugation, and technological dominance that enriched the Axis regimes while condemning much of the world to servitude and poverty. At the heart of the Axis economic order was a relentless focus on resource acquisition. Nazi Germany, now in control of Europe, much of Eurasia, and parts of the Middle East, seized vast oil reserves in the Caucasus and Persia, fueling its war machine and industrial expansion. The fertile plains of Ukraine, once the breadbasket of Europe, were transformed into the Reich's agricultural heartland, worked by millions of enslaved laborers. Rare earth minerals and metals from Siberia were mined at an astonishing pace, powering German advancements in technology and weaponry. The Nazi regime imposed strict economic hierarchies within its territories. Occupied nations were reduced to colonies, their industries dismantled or repurposed to serve German interests. Factories in France, Poland, and Czechoslovakia produced goods exclusively for the Reich, with local populations conscripted into forced labor. This system, known as the New Economic Plan, ensured that wealth and resources flowed upward to the German elite, leaving the conquered populations impoverished and dependent on German largesse for survival. Currency manipulation became another tool of economic control. In occupied territories, local currencies were either abolished or pegged to the Reichsmark at artificially devalued rates, allowing Germany to purchase goods and resources at minimal cost. The financial systems of these nations were integrated into the Reich's banking network, effectively eliminating their economic sovereignty. Japan adopted a similar approach in the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The empire's vast reach encompassed resource-rich regions, including the oil fields of Indonesia, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the tin mines of Thailand. These resources were transported to Japan's industrial centers, fueling its rapid technological development and military buildup. In the Pacific, Japan created a maritime empire, dominating trade routes and ensuring that goods and resources flowed exclusively to its ports. The Japanese military enforced strict control over these routes, eliminating piracy and rival shipping lines, but also suppressing local economies that relied on open trade. Southeast Asian economies were reoriented to serve Japan, with entire regions dedicated to producing single commodities for export. The Axis economic system was built on the backs of forced labor. Millions of people across Europe, Asia, and Africa were conscripted into servitude, working in mines, factories, and fields under brutal conditions. In Germany, concentration camp prisoners and enslaved workers from Eastern Europe were the backbone of the industrial workforce. In Japan's territories, local populations were coerced into labor, often under the pretense of contributing to the liberation of Asia. The infamous Burma-Thailand Railway and other infrastructure projects became symbols of this exploitation, as thousands perished in the construction of these monuments to imperial ambition. The Axis economic order also relied on technological superiority. Germany, now unencumbered by the constraints of war with the Allies, invested heavily in advanced industries. Jet aircraft, long-range missiles, and nuclear technology became the cornerstones of its military-industrial complex. Japan, meanwhile, expanded its naval and aviation capabilities, developing carriers, battleships, and advanced submarines to maintain control of the Pacific. These technological advancements further entrenched the Axis dominance, as no rival powers could match their industrial output or military innovation. While the Axis economic system appeared invincible, it was not without weaknesses. The sheer scale of the territories under Axis control created logistical challenges, as resources had to be transported across vast distances. This inefficiency, combined with the resistance movements in occupied territories, strained the empire's ability to maintain control. Sabotage, theft, and strikes by underground networks disrupted supply chains and undermined the Axis economic stability. Resistance also emerged from within. In Germany, some industrialists quietly opposed the regime, siphoning off resources to aid dissident groups or slow production. In Japan, local administrators in occupied territories sometimes sabotaged imperial efforts, diverting resources to support resistance fighters or to sustain local populations. The Axis economic order also faced ideological conflicts. Germany and Japan, while allied, had competing visions for global dominance. Germany's push into Central Asia brought it into direct competition with Japan, particularly over resources in the region. These tensions, though managed diplomatically for the time being, threatened to fracture the alliance in the future. The economic hierarchy imposed by the Axis powers also created resentment among their allies. Italy, often treated as a junior partner by Germany and Japan, struggled to assert control over its African colonies, which were seen as peripheral to the Axis grand strategy. Mussolini's regime, already weakened by internal dissent, found itself increasingly dependent on German support to maintain its influence. By the mid-1950s, the Axis economic order was a machine of immense power but also growing fragility. While it had succeeded in reshaping the global economy to serve its needs, it had done so at the cost of widespread suffering, instability, and resistance. The question was no longer whether this system could sustain itself indefinitely, but how long it could endure before the cracks in its foundation became irreparable. As the Axis powers celebrated their dominance, the seeds of rebellion and collapse were quietly taking root, hinting at a future where their empire might one day crumble under its own weight. In a world where the Axis powers emerged victorious in World War II, technological dominance became the cornerstone of their global hegemony. The unbridled ambition of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, coupled with their vast access to resources and enslaved labor, fueled unprecedented advancements in science, engineering, and military technology. While these developments bolstered their control over the world, they also came at an unimaginable human cost, further entrenching the horrors of their regimes. In Germany, the Reich's scientific community was tasked with fulfilling Hitler's vision of a technologically advanced empire. Freed from the constraints of international oversight and armed with resources extracted from its vast territories, Nazi engineers and scientists accelerated their work on advanced weaponry and infrastructure projects. By the mid-1950s, German research had yielded several breakthroughs, including operational nuclear weapons, long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and space exploration technologies. The Nazi atomic bomb program, which had lagged behind the Allies during the war in our timeline, became a reality in this alternate world. With access to the uranium mines of Central Africa and the scientific expertise of figures like Werner Heisenberg, Germany successfully detonated its first nuclear device in the Ural Mountains in the late 1940s. This achievement solidified the Reich's position as the preeminent military power, with nuclear weapons serving both as a deterrent against rivals and a tool for enforcing its will on the global stage. In addition to nuclear advancements, Germany expanded its missile program, building on the foundation of the V-2 rocket. By the 1950s, the Reich had developed ICBMs capable of striking targets across the Atlantic, effectively neutralizing the United States' ability to challenge its dominance. These missiles, combined with advanced jet fighters and bombers, gave Germany complete control over European airspace and beyond. The Reich also poured resources into space exploration, not for scientific curiosity but as a demonstration of its technological superiority. By the early 1960s, Germany had launched satellites into orbit and was preparing for manned space missions. The propaganda value of these achievements was immense, reinforcing the narrative of Aryan supremacy and the inevitability of Nazi rule. While Germany focused on dominance through weaponry and space exploration, Japan's technological efforts were geared toward naval and aviation advancements. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already one of the most formidable forces during World War II, expanded its capabilities to secure control of the Pacific and its surrounding regions. Advanced aircraft carriers, jet-powered fighter planes, and long-range submarines ensured Japan's naval supremacy, making it virtually impossible for any rival power to challenge its maritime dominance. Japan's engineers also worked on miniaturized nuclear weapons, aiming to deploy them aboard submarines and aircraft for strategic strikes. While Japan lagged slightly behind Germany in nuclear technology, its relentless focus on naval innovation kept its empire secure from external threats. The empire's emphasis on resource efficiency and the integration of cutting-edge technologies into its military infrastructure made it a formidable partner, and occasional rival, to Germany. The Axis power's technological dominance extended beyond the military. Massive infrastructure projects reshaped the landscapes of Europe and Asia, creating sprawling networks of railways, highways, and fortified cities designed to consolidate Axis control. Germany's Autobahn system, extended across occupied Europe and into Russia, served as both a logistical lifeline and a symbol of Nazi engineering prowess. In Asia, Japan undertook similar projects, including railways connecting its territories in Manchuria, Korea, and Southeast Asia, ensuring the seamless movement of resources and troops across its empire. Advancements in communications technology allowed the Axis regimes to tighten their grip on their populations. The Nazis perfected systems of surveillance and propaganda, using early computer technology and mass media to monitor dissent and indoctrinate citizens. Every home was equipped with state-controlled radios and televisions that broadcast a constant stream of pro-Axis messaging, while networks of informants ensured that resistance was crushed before it could gain momentum. medical and biological research also advanced under the Axis regimes, though at a horrifying cost. In Germany, the SS conducted experiments on prisoners in concentration camps, pushing the boundaries of human endurance and anatomy. These experiments, while ethically abhorrent, resulted in breakthroughs that were exploited to advance military medicine and biotechnology. Japan's infamous Unit 731 continued its inhumane research in occupied territories, developing biological and chemical weapons that were tested on civilian populations. The regime's disregard for human life made their scientific progress a double-edged sword, fueling their dominance while deepening the atrocities they committed. The Axis technological empire, however, was not without its challenges. The scale of their ambition created logistical bottlenecks, as resources and skilled labor were stretched thin across vast territories. Resistance movements targeted key infrastructure projects, sabotaging railways, factories, and power plants to disrupt Axis control. In addition, the competition between Germany and Japan occasionally led to tensions, as both powers sought to secure their own technological and strategic superiority. The unchecked technological advancements of the Axis powers also raised existential questions about the future of humanity. The development of autonomous weapons, enhanced surveillance systems, and biological warfare threatened to create a dystopian world where freedom and individuality were extinguished. Within the Axis territories, whispers of dissent grew louder, as scientists and engineers who had once supported the regimes began to question the morality of their work. By the late 1950s, the Axis powers stood at the zenith of their technological dominance. Yet, the very tools that had secured their victory also carried the seeds of their potential downfall. The reliance on exploitation and oppression to sustain their advancements created a brittle foundation, vulnerable to internal dissent and the relentless pressure of resistance movements. The world they had built was one of awe-inspiring innovation and terrifying control, a testament to the power of technology, wielded without ethics, in the hands of regimes that sought only domination. In a world where the Axis powers emerged victorious in World War II, the Cold War as we know it, an ideological battle between capitalism and communism, never materialized. Instead, the global stage was dominated by a new kind of tension, the uneasy alliance between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, which threatened to unravel as their competing ambitions clashed. While the United States and a handful of other neutral nations struggled to maintain independence, the two Axis superpowers vied for dominance, creating a geopolitical landscape defined by fragile alliances, covert operations, and the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. The roots of this new global tension lay in the very nature of the Axis alliance. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had united during World War II out of necessity, bound by a shared desire to dismantle the existing world order and establish their respective empires. However, their visions for the future were fundamentally different. Germany's focus was on racial purity, continental hegemony, and the colonization of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Japan, on the other hand, envisioned a maritime empire, controlling the Pacific and much of Asia through its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. By the late 1940s, these differences began to strain the alliance. Germany's push into Central Asia brought its forces into direct contact with Japanese-controlled territories in Manchuria and Mongolia, sparking disputes over resources and borders. The competition for influence in regions like India and the Middle East further deepened the divide, as both powers sought to secure strategic footholds in these resource-rich areas. The tension between Germany and Japan extended to the realm of technology and weaponry. While both powers had developed nuclear weapons, they kept their arsenals tightly guarded, each wary of the other's capabilities. The Nazi development of ICBMs capable of reaching the Pacific heightened Japanese fears, while Japan's advancements in naval-based nuclear delivery systems created unease in Berlin. This mutual suspicion fueled an arms race that dominated the 1950s, as both regimes poured resources into developing ever more destructive weapons. The United States, isolated by choice but not by circumstance, found itself in a precarious position. While President Charles Lindbergh's administration had negotiated a non-aggression pact with the Axis powers, the U.S. remained wary of their expansionist ambitions. American military planners quietly prepared for the possibility of conflict, investing heavily in nuclear weapons and missile defense systems. At the same time, the U.S. engaged in covert efforts to undermine Axis control, supporting resistance movements in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Neutral nations like Canada, Mexico, and Brazil found themselves caught in the crossfire of this new geopolitical order. Canada, though nominally independent, was heavily influenced by the United States and became a critical part of its defense strategy. In Latin America, pro-Axis regimes in countries like Argentina and Chile clashed with anti-Axis governments, creating a patchwork of alliances and rivalries that mirrored the broader global tension. The covert nature of this conflict gave rise to a world of espionage and subterfuge. Both Germany and Japan maintained extensive intelligence networks, infiltrating each other's territories as well as those of neutral nations. Spy agencies like the Nazi Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and Japan's Kempeitai engaged in sabotage, assassination, and counterintelligence operations, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. The United States, though officially neutral, also played a role in this shadow war, using its own intelligence agencies to gather information and disrupt Axis activities. While the rivalry between Germany and Japan was the primary axis of tension, resistance movements played a critical role in shaping the global landscape. In Europe, underground networks continued to fight against Nazi rule, staging acts of sabotage and gathering intelligence for the United States and other sympathetic nations. In Asia, guerrilla fighters in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia waged a relentless campaign against Japanese forces, often with tacit support from rival Axis powers or neutral nations. The global economy became another battleground in this unspoken conflict. Germany and Japan, while nominally allies, competed for control of resources and trade routes. Germany's exploitation of Eastern Europe and Russia provided it with a vast supply of minerals, oil, and agricultural products, while Japan's dominance in Southeast Asia and the Pacific made it a powerhouse in rubber, tin, and oil production. However, their mutual reliance on these resources created a delicate balance, as disruptions in one region could have cascading effects on both empires. Culturally, the divide between Germany and Japan became increasingly apparent. Nazi Germany promoted a vision of Aryan supremacy, dismissing Japan as a useful but ultimately inferior partner. Japan, in turn, emphasized its role as the leader of Asia, portraying itself as a liberator from Western imperialism while quietly resenting Germany's condescension. Propaganda from both sides reflected this underlying tension, with Germany celebrating its technological and military achievements while Japan emphasized its spiritual and cultural superiority. The 1950s were marked by a series of crises that brought the world to the brink of open conflict. One such flashpoint occurred in Central Asia, where German forces clashed with Japanese-backed militias over control of key oil fields. Another crisis unfolded in the Middle East, as German and Japanese intelligence agencies supported rival factions in an attempt to secure influence over the region's vast oil reserves. These incidents, though contained, highlighted the fragility of the Axis alliance and the potential for escalation. Despite these tensions, both Germany and Japan understood the risks of open war. The presence of nuclear weapons acted as a deterrent, forcing both sides to pursue their goals through covert means rather than direct confrontation. This balance of terror created a world reminiscent of the Cold War, though the ideological divide was not between communism and capitalism but between two competing visions of totalitarian domination. By the early 1960s, the cracks in the Axis alliance were becoming impossible to ignore. Germany and Japan, while still nominal allies, had become rivals in every sense of the word. Their competition for resources, influence, and technological superiority threatened to ignite a conflict that could devastate the world. At the same time, resistance movements in neutral nations began to find new opportunities to challenge Axis control, exploiting the divisions between the two powers. The Cold War that never was had created a world of relentless tension and perpetual fear. Yet, within this darkness, there remained a spark of hope that the rivalries of the Axis powers might one day lead to their downfall, and that the ideals of freedom and democracy could rise again from the ashes of a conquered world. Despite the Axis powers' iron grip on much of the world, resistance movements emerged as a defiant force against their oppressive rule. From the shattered cities of Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia, rebellion simmered beneath the surface. These movements were diverse, composed of ex-soldiers, displaced civilians, religious leaders, and underground networks, but they were united in their determination to fight back against the Nazi and Japanese empires. In Europe, the Nazi occupation of vast territories fueled an underground war. Resistance movements operated in nearly every conquered nation, from the French Maquis to the Polish Home Army and the Soviet partisans. These groups employed guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and espionage to disrupt Nazi supply lines, assassinate collaborators, and gather intelligence for sympathetic neutral powers like the United States. While many resistance fighters lacked resources and formal military training, their knowledge of local terrain and their unbreakable resolve allowed them to strike at the heart of the Nazi regime's operations. In the cities of Europe, underground networks grew sophisticated. Secret printing presses churned out anti-Nazi propaganda, while covert radio transmitters broadcast messages of hope and resistance. In Berlin, Vienna, and Warsaw, daring acts of defiance became symbols of courage in the face of tyranny. Resistance operatives infiltrated Nazi infrastructure, stealing blueprints, planting explosives, and leaking crucial information to the few remaining neutral powers. The Gestapo responded with brutal crackdowns, but for every cell they destroyed, another would rise in its place. The Axis-controlled East faced the most brutal repression, yet it also saw some of the fiercest resistance. In the forests of Poland and the Ukraine, partisan fighters waged a relentless guerrilla war against Nazi forces. Armed with stolen weapons and supplied by sympathetic locals, these groups disrupted supply routes, ambushed German convoys, and provided a vital lifeline to enslaved laborers seeking to escape Nazi-controlled industries. Entire regions became battlegrounds, as the partisans and the Wehrmacht clashed in a shadow war far from the view of Berlin's propaganda machine. In Japan's territories, resistance was no less determined. In China, guerrilla forces continued to fight despite the collapse of the nationalist and communist armies. Former soldiers, peasants, and intellectuals formed new coalitions, striking Japanese supply depots and ambushing military patrols. The countryside became a patchwork of contested zones, where Japanese forces struggled to maintain control against an enemy that could fade into the landscape and re-emerge unpredictably. Korea, under decades of harsh Japanese rule, saw its own resistance movement evolve. The Korean independence fighters operated both within the peninsula and from exile in neighboring territories. Smuggling weapons, printing anti-Japanese propaganda, and staging assassinations of Japanese officials, they fought to keep the dream of a free Korea alive. Despite brutal reprisals by the Japanese Kempeitai, the resistance refused to be extinguished. In Southeast Asia, anti-Japanese sentiment fueled guerrilla warfare in regions like the Philippines, Malaya, and Burma. Local fighters, often with support from American agents and remnants of Allied forces, carried out ambushes, destroyed infrastructure, and sabotaged Japanese efforts to extract resources. In the Philippines, the Hikbalahap guerrillas, who had resisted both American and Japanese colonization, intensified their efforts, liberating swathes of territory and building support among the rural population. Resistance movements faced immense challenges. The Axis powers were ruthless in their reprisals, employing collective punishment to deter rebellion. Entire villages were destroyed, hostages were executed, and collaborators were rewarded to root out insurgents. Propaganda campaigns portrayed resistance fighters as terrorists, further isolating them from populations that might have otherwise supported them. Yet the Axis powers' heavy-handed tactics often backfired. Brutal reprisals galvanized communities, turning previously neutral populations against their occupiers. In some cases, acts of defiance became rallying points for broader resistance. A single act of sabotage, like the destruction of a railway or the assassination of a high-ranking official, could inspire hundreds to join the fight. The resistance movements were not limited to those living under Axis rule. In neutral nations like the United States, Canada, and parts of Latin America, exiled leaders and dissidents worked tirelessly to support their comrades abroad. Refugee scientists, writers, and politicians formed governments in exile, broadcasting messages of hope and coordinating efforts with underground networks. These groups also lobbied their host nations to provide material support to the resistance, smuggling weapons, medical supplies, and funds into Axis-controlled territories. One of the most significant challenges faced by resistance movements was the lack of unity. Ideological divisions, ethnic rivalries, and differing strategies often hampered their efforts. In Europe, communist partisans clashed with nationalist groups, while in Asia, long-standing ethnic tensions created obstacles to cooperation. However, as the Axis powers tightened their grip, these divisions began to blur. The shared goal of liberation fostered uneasy alliances among factions that might otherwise have been at odds. By the mid-1950s, resistance movements had evolved into a global underground network. Covert operations spanned continents, with fighters in France, Poland, China, and the Philippines sharing tactics, intelligence, and resources. These connections were facilitated by neutral nations, particularly the United States, which, while officially disengaged, covertly supported the resistance through arms shipments, training programs, and intelligence sharing. The technological advancements of the Axis powers, while formidable, also created new opportunities for resistance. Saboteurs targeted critical infrastructure like railways, power plants, and communication lines, exploiting the very systems that the Axis relied upon to maintain control. Acts of sabotage were often timed to coincide with larger uprisings, creating chaos that overwhelmed the Axis ability to respond effectively. By the end of the 1950s, resistance movements had grown bolder, staging coordinated attacks on Axis facilities and symbols of power. In occupied Europe, massive uprisings broke out in several cities, forcing Nazi forces to divert resources from their eastern territories to quell the unrest. In Asia, guerrilla fighters began to reclaim territory in remote regions, eroding Japan's control over its empire. The resistance movements were far from achieving total victory, but their efforts chipped away at the Axis powers' illusion of invincibility. For the millions living under occupation, these acts of defiance provided hope that liberation, though distant, was still possible. The Axis regimes, despite their technological and military dominance, faced a growing realization: their control was not as absolute as they had once believed. In this alternate timeline, the Soviet Union never survived the Axis onslaught during World War II. Hitler's relentless push eastward, spearheaded by a reorganized and better prepared Operation Barbarossa, led to the capture of Moscow in late 1941 and the eventual disintegration of the USSR. By the mid-1940s, Nazi Germany had achieved total dominance over Soviet territory, from the Baltic states to the Ural Mountains, leaving a power vacuum that reshaped the region. The collapse of the Soviet Union had profound consequences for the people who lived within its borders. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan race, transformed the former Soviet territories into a nightmarish dystopia of exploitation, ethnic cleansing, and colonization. For the Axis powers, the fall of the USSR marked the fulfillment of a core wartime objective. For the millions of Slavs, Jews, and other minorities who called the region home, it was the beginning of an unimaginable tragedy. After the fall of Moscow, the Soviet leadership fractured. Stalin and his inner circle fled to the Ural Mountains, attempting to establish a temporary government in exile. However, their efforts to regroup were undermined by logistical failures, internal betrayals, and the rapid advance of German forces. By mid-1942, Stalin had been captured and executed by the SS, a symbolic victory for Hitler that was widely publicized as proof of the Reich's unstoppable might. The remnants of the Red Army, scattered and demoralized, continued to fight as partisans in the forests and mountains, but they were no match for the Nazi war machine. The former Soviet Union was divided into territories administered directly by Germany and puppet regimes that acted as extensions of the Reich. The Baltic states, Ukraine, and Belarus were among the first regions to be annexed outright, while the Caucasus and Central Asia became semi-autonomous colonies governed by Nazi-appointed officials. These areas were stripped of their resources, with German engineers overseeing the extraction of oil, coal, and metals vital to the Reich's economy. Ukraine, once the breadbasket of Europe, became a focal point of Hitler's colonization efforts. The Nazis implemented the Hunger Plan, a policy designed to starve local populations while redirecting food supplies to Germany. Millions of Ukrainians perished in the resulting famine, while the survivors were conscripted into forced labor or relocated to make way for German settlers. Entire villages were depopulated, and vast tracts of land were handed over to Aryan colonists who were incentivized to move eastward. The Slavic populations of Russia and Eastern Europe faced systematic persecution under Nazi rule. Hitler's racial ideology deemed Slavs as subhuman, fit only for servitude or extermination. Those who were not immediately executed were forced into labor camps, where they worked under inhumane conditions to support the Reich's infrastructure projects. The gulags of the Soviet era were replaced by Nazi concentration camps, which extended deep into Siberia, processing millions of victims in what became an industrialized system of genocide. The cultural erasure of the Soviet Union was another cornerstone of Nazi policy. The Russian language was banned in schools and public institutions, replaced by German or, in some cases, local dialects deemed acceptable by the Reich. Soviet monuments and symbols were destroyed, and historical narratives were rewritten to glorify Germanic heritage while erasing Slavic contributions. The Orthodox Church, which had endured under Stalin's rule, was systematically dismantled, its clergy imprisoned or executed. While the Nazi regime focused on exploiting the region's resources and subjugating its people, it also faced challenges in maintaining control over such a vast and diverse territory. The resistance movements that emerged in former Soviet lands were among the most determined and resourceful in the Axis-controlled world. Partisans in Belarus, Ukraine, and Siberia staged guerrilla campaigns, sabotaging railways, ambushing supply convoys, and assassinating Nazi officials. These fighters, often operating with minimal resources, relied on their intimate knowledge of the terrain and the support of local populations to continue their struggle. Despite their efforts, the resistance movements were unable to reclaim significant territory. The vastness of the former Soviet Union worked against them, as Nazi forces could isolate and overwhelm insurgent groups before they could consolidate their gains. Moreover, the brutality of Nazi reprisals, entire villages were massacred in response to partisan attacks, created an atmosphere of fear that stifled broader uprisings. The collapse of the Soviet Union also had ripple effects beyond its borders. Without the USSR as a counterweight to Nazi Germany, the balance of power in Eurasia shifted entirely in favor of the Axis powers. Central Asia, once a region of Soviet control, became a contested zone between Germany and Japan. Both powers sought to exploit its resources, particularly its oil fields, leading to tensions that would strain the Axis alliance in the years to come. For the people of the former Soviet Union, life under Nazi rule was a grim reality of survival. The dreams of socialism and industrial progress that had defined the USSR were replaced by a nightmarish existence of forced labor, starvation, and cultural annihilation. The collapse of the Soviet Union had not only reshaped the political map of the region but also extinguished a way of life for millions. By the late 1950s, the Nazi regime's control over the former Soviet Union remained firm but fragile. The sheer scale of the territory, combined with the relentless resistance of its people, created logistical and political challenges that even the Reich struggled to manage. While Hitler's vision of an Aryan-dominated East had become a reality on paper, the practicalities of maintaining such an empire revealed the limits of Nazi power. The collapse of the Soviet Union had marked a decisive victory for the Axis powers, but it also planted the seeds of their eventual unraveling. The subjugation of such a vast and diverse region required immense resources and constant vigilance, creating vulnerabilities that resistance movements and rival powers could exploit. The Axis had won the war, but the battle for control was far from over. In the aftermath of an Axis victory in World War II, the world's cultural landscape underwent a profound transformation. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan sought to reshape global society in their own images, imposing their ideologies on art, education, media, and religion. What emerged was a cultural order marked by censorship, propaganda, and the systematic erasure of traditions deemed incompatible with Axis ideals. Yet, beneath the surface, resistance to cultural domination simmered, preserving fragments of a suppressed world. Nazi Germany's approach to culture was rooted in the regime's obsession with racial purity and Aryan supremacy. The Reich sought to purge Europe of degenerate art and replace it with works that glorified Germanic heritage, militarism, and Hitler's vision of a thousand-year Reich. Museums were emptied of modernist, Jewish, and Slavic art, with paintings by artists like Picasso, Chagall, and Kandinsky either destroyed or sold to fund the Nazi regime. In their place, galleries displayed neoclassical works that celebrated the Aryan body and the mythologized Germanic past. Cinema became a powerful tool of propaganda under Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Films like Triumph of the Will and Olympia, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, became the standard for Nazi aesthetics, blending grandiose imagery with subtle ideological messaging. After the Axis victory, these techniques were exported across occupied Europe, with local filmmakers co-opted or replaced by German propagandists. The new wave of cinema glorified the Axis military conquests, demonized resistance movements, and celebrated the supposed benevolence of Nazi rule. Literature was tightly controlled. Books by Jewish, communist, and other undesirable authors were burned in mass ceremonies, and libraries were restocked with works that adhered to Nazi ideology. Fictional stories were rewritten to reflect Aryan values, while history books were heavily edited to erase contributions by non-Germanic cultures. In schools, children were taught a curriculum that emphasized racial superiority, loyalty to the Führer, and the triumph of the Reich. Across Europe, entire generations grew up immersed in a worldview designed to ensure their unwavering allegiance to Nazi ideals. The Japanese Empire's cultural transformation was similarly pervasive but took on a different character. In the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan portrayed itself as the liberator of Asia, freeing the region from Western imperialism. However, this narrative masked the empire's efforts to erase local traditions and impose Japanese culture. In Korea and Taiwan, the Japanese government implemented policies of forced assimilation. Korean and Taiwanese children were required to adopt Japanese names, speak only Japanese in schools, and pledge loyalty to the emperor. Traditional Korean and Chinese festivals were banned, replaced by celebrations of Japanese imperial achievements. Indigenous religions were suppressed, while Shinto shrines were erected across occupied territories as symbols of Japanese dominance. In Southeast Asia, cultural suppression was more strategic. While Japan tolerated certain local traditions to maintain order, it systematically dismantled symbols of Western influence, such as Christian churches and English-language schools. Japanese films, literature, and art flooded the region, promoting the ideals of imperial loyalty and the superiority of Japanese culture. Propaganda highlighted Japan's technological and military prowess, fostering a sense of inevitability about its rule. The transformation of culture under the Axis powers extended to architecture and urban planning. In Germany, Hitler's vision for the Reich was brought to life by architect Albert Speer, who oversaw the redesign of Berlin into Germania, a sprawling capital of monumental buildings and grand avenues. This architectural style, characterized by its stark symmetry and scale, was replicated across the empire, from Paris to Warsaw. Cities were reshaped to erase traces of local history, replacing them with structures that reflected Nazi dominance. In Japan, urban centers like Tokyo and Seoul were transformed to showcase imperial power. Traditional wooden structures were replaced by modern concrete and steel buildings, while streets were redesigned to accommodate military parades and industrial transport. Japanese architects combined elements of traditional design with modern engineering, creating a unique style that symbolized the empire's vision of progress. Music, too, was conscripted into the service of the Axis regimes. In Nazi Germany, jazz, swing, and other genres associated with African American and Jewish communities were banned, replaced by classical music and militaristic compositions that glorified the Reich. The works of composers like Wagner, Beethoven, and Strauss were elevated as symbols of Aryan culture. In Japan, traditional music was celebrated, but it was often repurposed to serve imperial propaganda. Marching songs and patriotic anthems became staples of public life, reinforcing loyalty to the emperor. Despite the overwhelming control exerted by the Axis powers, cultural resistance persisted. In occupied Europe, underground writers, artists, and musicians worked in secret to preserve their traditions and defy Nazi censorship. In Paris, a clandestine network of artists continued to create modernist works, smuggling them to neutral nations for safekeeping. In Poland, resistance fighters printed banned books and staged secret performances of plays and music that celebrated their heritage. In Japan's territories, resistance took on a similar form. In Korea, secret schools taught children the Korean language and history, defying Japanese assimilation policies. Folk songs and dances were preserved in rural areas, away from the watchful eyes of imperial authorities. In China, underground theaters performed plays that critiqued Japanese rule, using allegory and symbolism to evade censorship. The transformation of culture under the Axis powers was one of their most insidious weapons, as it sought not only to control territories but to reshape the minds and identities of their people. Yet, the resilience of human creativity and the enduring power of cultural heritage ensured that Axis domination was never complete. Beneath the surface of their empires, suppressed voices continued to sing, write, and create, preserving the essence of what the Axis sought to destroy. As the 1960s approached, the cracks in the Axis cultural order began to grow. Resistance movements became bolder, using culture as a weapon to rally support and inspire defiance. The Axis regimes, while technologically and militarily dominant, faced the realization that true control over a people's spirit could never be fully achieved. The Axis powers' victory in World War II not only redefined borders and economies but also reshaped societies at their core. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan implemented sweeping changes to governance, education, and daily life, creating a rigid social order built on hierarchy, obedience, and ideology. Their vision extended beyond mere control. They sought to construct a world in which their values were immutable, woven into the very fabric of existence. In Nazi Germany's Greater Reich, the social order was strictly stratified according to race and loyalty to the state. At the apex stood the Aryan elite, deemed the pinnacle of humanity by Nazi racial ideology. Citizenship was not a right but a privilege reserved for those who could prove their racial purity and unwavering loyalty to the Führer. Those deemed undesirable, Jews, Slavs, Romani, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others, were excluded entirely, their lives reduced to servitude, displacement, or extermination. The Reich's racial hierarchy extended into all aspects of life. Marriage and reproduction were heavily regulated by the state, with programs like Lebensborn promoting the birth of Aryan children. Women were celebrated as mothers of the Reich, their roles confined to child-rearing and homemaking in service of the state's expansionist ambitions. Men, meanwhile, were expected to embody martial virtues, serving in the military or laboring in industries vital to the Reich. Education became a tool of indoctrination. From a young age, children were immersed in Nazi ideology through schools that prioritized racial theory, history glorifying Germanic conquests, and physical fitness to prepare them for military service. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls replaced traditional youth organizations, ensuring that every child grew up with an unwavering allegiance to the Nazi Party. Critical thinking and dissent were systematically eradicated, replaced by a cult of personality around Adolf Hitler and an acceptance of the Reich's eternal rule. In the occupied territories, the new social order was even more brutal. Slavic populations were subjugated as second-class laborers, their lives valued only insofar as they served the Reich's needs. Entire towns were razed to make way for German settlers, who were granted privileged access to housing, education, and resources. In some cases, young children with Aryan features were forcibly taken from their families and raised as Germans, erasing their cultural heritage in the name of racial purity. Imperial Japan's new social order shared similarities with that of Nazi Germany but was rooted in its own traditions and imperial ideology. At the center of Japan's system was the emperor, revered as a divine figure whose authority was absolute. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was presented as a harmonious community of Asian nations united under Japan's leadership. In reality, it was a rigid hierarchy with Japan at the top and all other nations relegated to subservient roles. In Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria, Japanese officials imposed assimilation policies designed to erase local identities and replace them with imperial loyalty. Children were educated in Japanese, and the histories of their own cultures were rewritten to emphasize their supposed inferiority to Japan. Traditional family structures were undermined by state interventions that promoted loyalty to the emperor above all else. Resistance to these policies was met with swift and brutal reprisals, including imprisonment, torture, and execution. The Co-Prosperity Sphere's social order extended to the labor force. In Southeast Asia, workers were conscripted into massive infrastructure projects, such as railways, mines, and factories, under conditions that mirrored slavery. The Japanese military enforced strict discipline, with harsh punishments for those who resisted or failed to meet quotas. Indigenous populations were often displaced to make way for Japanese settlers, who were given preferential treatment in housing and access to resources. Gender roles in Japan's empire were heavily influenced by traditional Confucian and Shinto values. Women were expected to support the empire as dutiful wives and mothers, their lives centered on family and community. However, many were also exploited as comfort women, forced into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers, a practice that underscored the empire's brutal treatment of conquered peoples. The new social order imposed by the Axis powers was reinforced by surveillance and propaganda. In both Germany and Japan, citizens were encouraged to report neighbors, colleagues, and even family members suspected of disloyalty. Informant networks created a pervasive atmosphere of fear, ensuring that dissent was quashed before it could spread. Mass rallies, parades, and ceremonies celebrated the regime's achievements, fostering a sense of unity and inevitability about their rule. Despite the oppressive nature of the Axis social order, cracks began to appear as the years wore on. The rigid hierarchies and constant surveillance bred resentment among the subjugated populations, fueling resistance movements and underground networks. Even within the Axis empires, dissent quietly grew. Some Germans and Japanese, particularly those in the scientific and intellectual communities, began to question the morality of their regimes and sought ways to undermine them from within. In occupied territories, the subjugated populations found ways to resist the new social order. In Eastern Europe, underground schools preserved Slavic languages and traditions, defying Nazi assimilation policies. In Korea and Taiwan, secret societies formed to teach band histories and celebrate indigenous culture. These acts of defiance, though small in scale, kept alive the hope of liberation. By the late 1950s, the Axis powers' social order remained outwardly strong but was increasingly fragile beneath the surface. The sheer scope of their empires made it difficult to maintain control, and the constant need to suppress rebellion drained resources and morale. The rigid hierarchies they had imposed created divisions even within their own societies, as those excluded from privilege sought ways to challenge the status quo. The new social order of the Axis powers was a testament to their ability to impose control on a vast scale. Yet, the resilience of human spirit and the enduring power of cultural identity hinted at the possibility that even the most oppressive systems could one day be dismantled. In the Axis-dominated world, science became both a tool of advancement and a weapon of control. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, unrestrained by ethical oversight, exploited their vast resources and subjected populations to horrific experiments in the pursuit of their ideological and military goals. The science of oppression defined this era, as breakthroughs in medicine, technology, and industry were achieved at the unimaginable cost of human suffering. Nazi Germany's scientific pursuits were driven by the regime's obsession with racial purity and military superiority. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler's SS and institutions like the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, human experimentation reached new depths of depravity. Concentration camps such as Auschwitz became laboratories where prisoners were subjected to brutal experiments. Twins were separated and tested by Joseph Mengele, who sought to understand genetic inheritance and manipulate it to produce perfect Aryans. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to hypothermia, infectious diseases, and toxic gases to test survival techniques and treatments for German soldiers. The results of these experiments were often presented as scientific achievements within the Reich, even as they caused untold suffering. Medical discoveries, such as advanced techniques for wound treatment and surgical innovations, were extracted from these inhumane practices. However, the pursuit of knowledge was secondary to the regime's ideological goals. Many experiments were carried out with no scientific purpose other than to affirm Nazi beliefs about racial inferiority or to dehumanize their victims further. In the industrial sector, Nazi scientists and engineers developed groundbreaking technologies that would reshape the 20th century. Rocketry, led by Wernher von Braun and the V-2 missile program, advanced rapidly with the use of enslaved laborers in subterranean factories like Mittelwerk. These missiles, initially designed for short-range attacks, were refined into intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of reaching targets thousands of miles away. The fear of Axis missile strikes became a constant in the post-war world, underscoring the moral compromises made in their development. The Nazis also pushed forward in nuclear research, achieving breakthroughs that allowed them to detonate their first atomic bomb in the late 1940s. This success cemented Germany's dominance in Europe and ensured that no rival could challenge its power without facing nuclear retaliation. However, the production of these weapons relied heavily on forced labor and environmental destruction, as uranium mines in Africa and Eastern Europe were worked under deadly conditions. Imperial Japan's scientific endeavors mirrored those of Nazi Germany but were often driven by the empire's militaristic and territorial ambitions. Unit 731, the notorious Biological and Chemical Weapons Research Unit, continued its activities across the co-prosperity sphere. In occupied territories like China and Manchuria, entire villages were subjected to experiments involving anthrax, plague, and other deadly pathogens. Victims were intentionally infected and monitored as diseases ravaged their bodies, all in the name of developing weapons to secure Japan's dominance. Chemical weapons developed by Japanese scientists were used in Southeast Asia, often under the guise of counterinsurgency operations. Forests and farmlands were sprayed with toxins to root out guerrilla fighters, while civilian populations were exposed to experimental gases. The results were devastating, leaving scars on the land and its people that would last for generations. In the medical field, Japanese doctors conducted forced sterilizations and surgeries on prisoners to explore eugenics and population control. Women in occupied territories were subjected to experiments aimed at increasing birth rates among Japanese settlers while suppressing reproduction in local populations. These experiments, like those in Nazi Germany, were carried out with complete disregard for the lives of their subjects. The technological ambitions of Imperial Japan also extended to naval and aviation advancements. Japan pioneered miniaturized nuclear weapons for use on submarines and aircraft, creating a fleet of stealthy delivery systems capable of devastating enemy targets. These innovations were built on the backs of enslaved workers, who toiled in extreme conditions to produce the materials and components needed for Japan's war machine. The Axis powers' lack of ethical constraints allowed them to achieve significant technological and medical advancements, but these came at a profound moral cost. The widespread use of human subjects in experiments and the exploitation of labor created a scientific culture devoid of humanity. Discoveries that could have been used to improve lives were instead weaponized, perpetuating the suffering of millions. The long-term consequences of the Axis science of oppression extended beyond their immediate victims. Environmental destruction from unregulated mining, chemical testing, and nuclear experimentation left entire regions uninhabitable. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors of forced labor and experimentation created generational scars, while the propaganda used to justify these practices entrenched ideologies of superiority and dehumanization. Despite the Axis powers' dominance, their scientific advancements did not go unchallenged. In secret, scientists and intellectuals within the Reich and the co-prosperity sphere began to question the regime's methods and motivations. Some defected to neutral nations, bringing with them knowledge of Axis technology and exposing the atrocities committed in its pursuit. Others sabotaged research projects from within, slowing the development of new weapons and spreading dissent among their peers. By the late 1950s, the cracks in the Axis scientific empire were beginning to show. The unsustainable exploitation of resources, combined with resistance from occupied populations and dissident scientists, created vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. The regime's reliance on fear and repression to maintain their control over the scientific community further alienated the very minds they needed to sustain their dominance. The science of oppression, while central to the Axis powers' rise, also sowed the seeds of their eventual decline. The technologies they developed, born of cruelty and exploitation, became symbols of their inhumanity, rallying resistance against their rule. As the world braced for what lay ahead, it became clear that even the most advanced machines of war and control could not extinguish the resilience of the human spirit. By the late 1950s, the Axis powers appeared to stand unchallenged, their empires spanning continents and their technological dominance unassailable. But beneath the surface of their monolithic regimes, cracks were beginning to show. The sheer scale of their territories, the inherent contradictions of their ideologies, and the resistance of subjugated populations created vulnerabilities that even their immense power could not conceal. The world Hitler and Hirohito had built was vast, but it was far from stable. One of the most significant sources of tension lay within the Axis alliance itself. Germany and Japan, united by a shared desire to dismantle the old world order, were now rivals in shaping the new one. The division of Eurasia, once agreed upon during the height of the war, became a contentious issue as the two powers expanded their ambitions. Central Asia, with its vast oil reserves and strategic importance, was a flashpoint. Nazi troops clashed with Japanese-backed militias in regions like Kazakhstan, while both powers sought to control trade routes running through the area. The rivalry extended to the Pacific, where Japan's dominance threatened German interests in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. German naval patrols, initially cooperative with their Japanese counterparts, began to encroach on Japanese-controlled waters, prompting tense standoffs. These territorial disputes strained diplomatic relations, with both sides accusing the other of undermining the alliance. The Axis powers' economies, built on exploitation and forced labor, also showed signs of strain. The vast territories under their control required immense resources to govern, and the reliance on enslaved populations created inefficiencies and instability. In Eastern Europe, Nazi administrators faced growing resistance from laborers who sabotaged factories and infrastructure. Rail lines were disrupted, shipments disappeared, and productivity declined, forcing the Reich to divert military resources to maintain order. In the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan's economy was similarly overextended. The relentless extraction of resources from colonies like Korea, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia fueled industrial growth in Japan but left local economies in ruin. Famine and poverty became widespread, leading to unrest that even Japan's brutal military crackdowns could not entirely suppress. Resistance movements in territories like the Philippines, Malaya, and Burma targeted mines, plantations, and ports, disrupting the flow of resources to Japan and undermining its economic stability. Resistance was not confined to the periphery. Within the core territories of the Axis powers, dissent began to grow. In Nazi Germany, a new generation of intellectuals, scientists, and even military officers quietly questioned the regime's policies. Some were motivated by ethical concerns, horrified by the atrocities committed in the name of the Reich. Others saw the inefficiencies and corruption within the Nazi bureaucracy as a threat to Germany's long-term survival. Underground networks of dissent emerged, even in the heart of Berlin. Former Wehrmacht officers who had been sidelined during Hitler's consolidation of power began to organize in secret, hoping to restore a semblance of rational governance to the Reich. These groups, though fragmented and closely monitored by the Gestapo, represented a growing undercurrent of opposition that the regime could not ignore. In Japan, similar cracks appeared. The samurai-inspired militarism that had united the empire began to falter under the weight of its contradictions. Younger generations, educated in the imperial system but exposed to the suffering of occupied populations, began to question the legitimacy of Japan's rule. Among the Zaibatsu, the powerful industrial conglomerates that formed the backbone of Japan's economy, whispers of dissent grew louder as economic instability threatened their profits. The Axis powers' reliance on surveillance and repression to maintain control created additional vulnerabilities. The Gestapo in Germany and the Kempeitai in Japan operated vast networks of informants, but the sheer scale of their empires made it impossible to monitor everyone. Resistance movements exploited these gaps, infiltrating Axis institutions and spreading discontent among soldiers, workers, and civilians. Technological advancements, once a cornerstone of Axis dominance, also became a double-edged sword. The sophisticated infrastructure and weaponry that had secured their empires required constant maintenance and resources, which were increasingly difficult to obtain. Sabotage by resistance fighters further strained these systems, while rivalries within the Axis powers complicated their ability to coordinate technological development. The pressure of resistance and internal dissent was compounded by the inherent instability of totalitarian governance. Hitler's Reich, for all its outward strength, depended heavily on the Führer's personal authority. As Hitler aged and his health declined, power struggles emerged among his inner circle. Himmler, Göring, and Speer jockeyed for influence, their competing visions for the future of the Reich creating divisions within the Nazi leadership. In Japan, the divine authority of the emperor masked similar fractures within the military and political elite. Rival factions within the imperial army and navy clashed over strategy and resource allocation, while civilian leaders struggled to balance the demands of the military with the growing discontent of the population. The rigid hierarchy that had once unified Japan now stifled its ability to adapt to new challenges. By the early 1960s, the cracks in the Axis empires had become impossible to ignore. Resistance movements grew bolder, launching coordinated attacks on Axis infrastructure and rallying support from neutral nations like the United States. Within the Axis territories, whispers of rebellion turned into open defiance as subjugated populations seized opportunities to challenge their oppressors. The fragile balance between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan teetered on the edge of collapse. Their alliance, once the foundation of their global dominance, now threatened to become their undoing. As the world watched, the question was no longer whether the Axis powers could be challenged, but whether their empires could withstand the weight of their own contradictions. By the early 1960s, the world shaped by an Axis victory in World War II stood at a precarious crossroads. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had carved the globe into vast empires, their dominance secured through technological superiority, military might, and oppressive control. Yet, the cracks in their regimes, fueled by internal strife, resistance movements, and the unsustainable nature of their systems, threatened to unravel everything they had built. Even as the Axis powers appeared invincible, the long-term consequences of their dark victory began to reveal themselves. One of the most profound legacies of the Axis triumph was the psychological and cultural impact on the world's populations. For those living under Nazi rule in Europe, daily life had been reduced to a grim struggle for survival. Entire cultures and identities had been systematically erased. In Eastern Europe, Slavic populations were displaced or exterminated to make way for German settlers, leaving behind a scarred landscape of ghost towns and abandoned villages. The Holocaust had annihilated millions of Jewish people, Romani, and other minorities, and its survivors lived in a world that had turned its back on them. In Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a similar erasure of identity and culture had taken place. Local traditions were suppressed, and entire generations grew up under the shadow of Japanese imperialism. Resistance was crushed with unrelenting brutality, and collaboration was often the only means of survival. Yet, even among those who conformed, resentment simmered, passed down through families and communities as a quiet defiance that the empire could not extinguish. The global economic order was another enduring legacy of the Axis victory. Both Germany and Japan had established economies that thrived on exploitation, forced labor, and resource extraction. While this system had initially fueled their rise, by the 1960s, its limitations were clear. Resource shortages, sabotage by resistance movements, and the inefficiencies of slave labor strained both empires. Economies in subjugated territories were hollowed out, their industries repurposed solely for the benefit of their overlords. In this unequal world, wealth and prosperity were concentrated in the Axis heartlands, while poverty and desperation defined life for the majority. The geopolitical landscape was dominated by the tension between the Axis powers and the few remaining neutral nations, particularly the United States. Although officially disengaged, the U.S. had become a hub for exiled leaders, dissident scientists, and underground resistance movements. American policymakers, wary of directly confronting the Axis, instead supported covert operations aimed at undermining the regimes. This indirect conflict, marked by espionage, sabotage, and propaganda, hinted at the possibility of a second global struggle, one in which the remaining free nations would attempt to reclaim what had been lost. The Axis alliance itself began to fray under the weight of its contradictions. The rivalry between Germany and Japan, once tempered by their shared goals, had escalated into an open contest for dominance. Disputes over resources in Central Asia, influence in the Middle East, and control of the Indian Ocean created a Cold War between the two powers. While both sides maintained the pretense of unity, their competition in military buildup and territorial expansion signaled that war between them was no longer a question of if, but when. Within the Axis territories, resistance movements continued to grow. These underground networks, though fragmented and under constant threat, coordinated acts of defiance that disrupted supply lines, sabotaged infrastructure, and kept the dream of liberation alive. In Europe, the Polish resistance staged daring attacks on Nazi installations, while in Asia, guerrilla fighters in the Philippines and Burma reclaimed swaths of territory from Japanese forces. The Axis regimes expended vast resources to suppress these uprisings, creating a cycle of repression and rebellion that further strained their empires. The cultural legacy of the Axis victory was equally complex. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had attempted to reshape the world in their image, but their impositions were met with quiet acts of cultural preservation. In secret, forbidden books were read, suppressed songs were sung, and banned traditions were passed down to younger generations. These acts of defiance ensured that, even under the harshest conditions, the Axis could not fully erase the identities of those they sought to dominate. For the Axis powers themselves, the legacy of their victory was not only one of dominance but of paranoia and insecurity. The need to maintain control over vast territories required constant vigilance and repression. Surveillance states flourished, with informants embedded in every community and dissidents hunted relentlessly. Yet, this very surveillance created an atmosphere of mistrust that extended even to the highest levels of leadership. In Nazi Germany, the absence of clear succession plans led to internal power struggles as Hitler's health declined. Factions within the Reich vied for control, their competing visions for the future creating divisions that weakened the regime. In Japan, similar tensions emerged as the rigid hierarchy of the imperial system clashed with the realities of governing a vast and diverse empire. The Axis powers' technological dominance, while formidable, also carried unintended consequences. The development of nuclear weapons, advanced rocketry, and biological warfare created a perpetual state of fear among both their enemies and their own populations. The world had entered a new era of existential threat, where the tools of war could obliterate entire cities in moments. By the late 1960s, the legacy of the Axis victory had become one of unfulfilled promises and growing instability. The empires they had built were vast but brittle, their foundations eroded by resistance, rivalry, and the unsustainable nature of their systems. For the millions who lived under their rule, hope persisted, not because the Axis seemed weak, but because history had shown that even the mightiest empires could fall. As the world teetered on the edge of a new conflict, the lessons of the Axis victory remained stark reminders of what unchecked ambition, ideology, and power could create and destroy. The legacy of this dark victory was not only a cautionary tale but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, which refused to be extinguished even in the face of unimaginable oppression.